I'll tell you a funny story about when I had my first startup, when I went into to meet with a VC. So long story short, it took a couple of meetings to get this guy to actually meet with me. So I show up at his office like 8:30 in the morning. We're supposed to meet at 9. So I see the conference room. I see his assistant, and she looks horrified. Like she looks like a person who's like literally reporting to Kim Jong Un, right? Like she's like the wrong words are said, and I'm like, I sense this energy. I'm like, what is happening here, right? So at first, I'm like joking with her, and she's just like, "Good luck." And the way she said it, I was like,
Wow.
right. So I get in the conference room, and I'm like, okay, let me set up my laptop so I can do the presentation. And she's just looking at me, and she's like, buddy, you're a bunny running into a buzz, so you have no idea what's coming your way. So again, I don't think anything of it. The guy shows up, I introduce myself, and I'm like, so let me tell you about my company. You know what he said to me? He goes, shut the fuck up. Let me ask you a question. I have enough money here to that enables me to piss on you, to drown you in my urine. Why should I listen to you? That's how he introduced himself to me. I was just like, am I on a different planet?
Where
Like
did
what?
you go with that?
Yeah. I stared at him and I said, you know what? I said, where I come from, when people speak like that, their throats get slashed.
Welcome to the Furrowed Brow with Jeffrey Kipler. Yeah, let's just get into this then if you're ready.
You got it.
Awesome. So, quick intro. Twitter is the gift that keeps on giving, and how I became familiar with today's guest, Ahsan Deliri. I became familiar with Ace through what might previously be described as Taleb Twitter. In my mind, he's a practical philosopher whose insights I greatly enjoy and value. He also has a fantastic podcast, Risky Conversation, that's now in its third year. I'm honored that he's joining me here on the Furrowed Brow. So welcome, Ace.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the kind words. I wouldn't go so far as labeling myself anything as a philosopher. I'm more of a pragmatist who tries to get things done, and that's part of the reason why you and I got together, because we both recognized that there was something afoot with regards to Nassim's ideas versus how he responded to the COVID pandemic and the mass vaccinations, and it kind of went completely against what he normally preaches, and
It was
that's why I always tell
incredible.
people, yeah, it was
It was
blindsiding.
incredible. Like I mean, I'm looking up at my bookshelf right now, and I have, and I think he pronounces it as Incerto, the entire 5 volume set. And I've read all of the books at least once,
Right.
and it's really was some of the most important ways of looking at things that vastly different, that changed my worldview in many ways. And I hated his writing to start out with, but I
Right.
became really an acolyte in many ways. And then all of a sudden, like you were saying, COVID hit, and it was like, what is going on here?
Yeah, you know what, sometimes you start to think about these issues, and for the longest time, I gave the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, maybe he sees something I don't see. Clearly, there's got to be something more to the story. But as more and more of the insanity started to unravel around us, and his ideas, not only did he validate and authenticate what was being said, but he was also invalidating his own works,
Right.
right?
And
So that was,
and
yeah,
reasonable disagreement, people can disagree on, like, I think the major one is a precautionary principle,
mm-hmm.
where, just for our listeners, in case they're not familiar, is this idea that when you're doing something, especially that has potential massive knock-on effects, you really want to be careful. You want to put precaution first. And I feel like when we look at COVID, like, reasonable people can disagree with whether it is more important to try to stop something that's infection and has multiplicative effects, versus the danger of rolling out of a potentially untested vaccine, like we saw with the COVID vaccine, where we don't know the effects also. But
Mm.
to out of hand say that one is obviously better than the other and everybody else is a fool is flabbergasting to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll start with 2 points there. First and foremost, the precautionary principle itself, right? So up until recently, it seemed like a good idea on paper,
Yeah.
but then we saw what happens when it got applied in reality, and it completely turns into a nightmarish disaster. And there's a clear-cut example of how we know this doesn't work. The reason the precautionary principle doesn't work is it requires people to implement it. and people are flawed. And the perfect
Yeah.
example of that is, hey, you got a mom and pop shop? Sorry, we're shutting you down, buddy. It's COVID. Oh, my buddy's running Walmart. He's okay.
Yeah.
He's okay. He's all right. Don't worry about him. We need him running. So you see, right off the bat, you see what
Right.
happens with the principle. Because a human being has to implement it, that human being has flaws and biases, that human being is a politician who is going to be under the pressure of various donors, power classes, whatever you want to call it. And as soon as that happens, it's going to crumble on its own weight. But what it's beautiful is it turns into a bludgeon for that same politician. So in Ontario, where I live, our premier, Doug Ford, this guy, when you hear him talk, you could tell that he has never read the precautionary principle paper. In fact, when I first read it, I was tweeting parts of it that was interesting in a thread, and it was a long conversation that people were joining in on. So I found some of the ideas insightful, but I never really thought the whole concept through until the very end, when two friends of mine, one's Michael Driver and one's George Cooper, and what they said to me was, they said, "Hey, I know this looks good, but I want you to remember something very interesting." I said, "What's that?" He said, "The smartest people are the easiest people to fool are the people who think they're really smart."
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And I thought about it for a long time, and I said, "Where's the flaw in it?" He goes, "When you see it, it'll be much more interesting than if we tell it to you." So I said, "Okay." Waited around, didn't think much of it. But I tried to steelman Naseeb's point of view. And here's the point of view, the best I can understand his, because you want to be fair, right? When you're criticizing somebody else's point of view, you want to be fair. So the very best argument he presented was, given your overall mass, given how many things you consume, given how long you've been alive for, one injection couldn't possibly create the amount of harm and damage that you think it can. That was the best argument he can lay out. I listened to it, various times. His ideas of what he calls them, COVID psychopaths or COVID idiots, all that stuff aside.
Yeah.
You tried to get to the root of it, which was, okay, people do drugs all the time, right? People have done really crazy drugs and they've kind of recovered from it. People have had really terrible accidents and they've recovered from it. So the dosage and the timing of the dosage and all that stuff, given the vast array of people, he said that based on that piece of information, you could presume that no matter how harmful it is, it can't be as harmful as you think it is, which is also not a bad take on the issue. However, like you said, untested technology rolled out brand new. This is on the heels of the whole Monsanto GMO food problem. So you kind of look at that and you go, okay, listen, I don't know where to, like, at this point, it's fairly reasonable to assume that either you are throwing your life's work away or you're compromised somewhere. Somebody has something on you and they're saying something about you. They're saying, listen, this is, and we see it, like, you see a bunch of reasonable people that normally would just speak out the truth, all of a sudden ducking this whole issue, or all of a sudden taking the side that supposedly everybody else has taken. And these are the people whose cantankerous nature would lead you to assume that they would take the opposite side.
Yeah.
So when they don't, you have a couple of options as to why that's the case. It also could genuinely be that the person actually believes this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to do that when there's 3 years of live data in front of you and experimentation of a catastrophe, and the precautionary principle being used as a bludgeon across the world by every incompetent, inept political operation for everybody to see. And yet again, you're not able to, like, and Joe Norman is the perfect example of the opposite direction, because Joe looked at it and he's one of the co-authors of the paper as well. And he came around to the issue and he said, no, this doesn't seem to make sense. This seems to go against everything we've always talked about. This is the very definition of localism being rejected.
Yeah.
Right. So after you look at all that, you say, okay, maybe it's time for people to sort of look at this from their own point of view, through their own lens. And if they can't judge for themselves, that's okay. Right. We live in a world where we arbitrage opportunities. And if your opportunity doesn't let you recognize the fact that you don't need to be sitting in a car driving by yourself wearing a mask, that's okay, right? I'm okay with that. As long as you don't tell me I have to do it. That's where we draw the line. I'm cool with it. Go ahead. I still see people in Canada wearing masks, driving in the car by themselves, going to grocery stores wearing masks, socially distancing. It's been programmed into their mindset that that's their way of that's their life now, right? And that's what they do. That's okay. Cool. Do it. I'm totally, I come from Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Communist rule came in. Anytime somebody tells you what to do, there's an instinctive part of your deep psychology that immediately stands up and says, you know what, I don't care what you're saying. The fact that you're forcing me to do this by the barrel of the gun, because that's what the state is all about, I'm gonna have to disagree. Right.
Yes.
We escaped that country for that very purpose. My parents, we had a very nice life back home. So just to give you an idea, we lived in a castle. We had servants. Really? Yes, like that. We have there's a whole part of the province where that's like a section of a town named after my last name, Deliri.
Wow.
Right? I mean, that's the kind of life we left behind, and we came to Canada, and we were so poor at the beginning that when we were here, and I was a kid. We used to go to the grocery store, and my parents would take me with them so I can carry some of the groceries, because we didn't have money for the bus or the cab. We just had enough money to get the food to survive to the next round, right? Wow. So to go from a castle to that, and to recognize, okay, why did that happen? And I asked my parents. I said, listen, when the communists take over, nothing is yours. Yeah. In fact, the things that you thought were yours are reasons for you to be targeted even more, because now you're the enemy class.
Yep.
Right. And initially it just comes around with a conversation, but we know where that conversation is going to go, and we don't want to be part of it. So we left everything behind. And so innately in my mindset, it's like a particular track of a song. As soon as I hear it, I know, I see the tone. I hear what you're saying. I know what the next dance is going to be all about, and I'm going to leave the room before it gets to that stage.
Wow. That's a hell of a story, Ace. So I assume that was in the 80s your parents came over.
Yeah, so we left Afghanistan in 1989 by the skin of our teeth. I was born in 82. My parents had to, just to give you an idea of how absurd the whole system set up over there was, you couldn't leave with any of your credentials. So they didn't want, because if you're an educated person, you wanted to set up a good life for yourself elsewhere, which is usually what happens in countries where things fall apart. The educated class, if they get an opportunity,
you get the brain drain.
Exactly. But there they said, oh, you know what? Nobody gets any credentials. So you leave, and all of a sudden you can't even prove that you were what you say you are.
Yeah.
Right now. Now, it doesn't sound terrible, but if you do it across en masse, it's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen that show, Suits. There's an episode, so to give you a gist of it, there's an episode where one of the characters, he basically impersonates people and writes the LSAT test for them. And when he goes up to the front to give it to the instructor feels suspicious, and he puts his test aside. And what happens is he goes, do you know who I am? He said, no. And what he does is he knocks over all the tests. Now you can't tell which one was his and which one wasn't his, right? So if you knock over everybody's quote unquote credentials, you don't know who is, and you don't know who isn't a real doctor or a real engineer or a real X. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So you leave that country, wherever you go, you're now a nobody, so to speak. First thing they label you as is you're a refugee. Fair enough, understandable. Then it's kind of like what happened with the Jews in Nazi Germany, right? Yeah. They take away everything from you because they don't want you to have a shot at success anywhere else you go. Right. And so so that's an extreme reaction. I said, yeah, but that's because we've lived through it. We know what it's like. Now people will, like, the next time there's a quote unquote pandemic, watch how many people are actually going to believe what's being told. Right. This happened in our lifetimes. We've never experienced it. So initially we all said, okay, maybe these people know what they're talking about. And then we start to see it unravel, and we're like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Not only do you not know what you're talking about, to quote John Archibald Wheeler, you're not even wrong.
Yeah. I mean, so you probably aren't aware of this, but my wife is a PhD geneticist, right? Like, she knows tons about mRNA vaccines, and like at first she looked at all of the data coming out of Pfizer and what have you, and she's like, yeah, it looks good. It looks like it, doesn't look harmful, doesn't look suspicious. And now I don't know shit about shit when it comes to like that sort of world, but I've got the same thing going on as you. I've got alarm bells going off in my head that like this hasn't been tested that way. Like, it hasn't been tested for that long. They're trying to force it on it. You see this pattern, and I'm just like, emergency. I mean, I ended up getting vaccinated with the 2 shots, and I'm fine for it as far as I can tell. But now, like, now we're both looking back like, wow, there were things afoot then that were not obvious, especially with somebody, even if you have an academic background in the space, that, you do trust the system. You were you were academically raised within it. And but if you don't, but if you haven't, I feel like if you haven't gone through things like escaping communist Afghanistan, like you might not notice these other things going on.
Well, you know what? In fairness to yourself and to your wife, here's the thing, right? The problem is we look at the world through our own point of view. If
Yeah.
we're honest, decent people, we assume other people are the same way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's where the asymmetry. So one of my major philosophical shifts in the last little while has been the idea of looking for informational asymmetry and how to exploit it. All right. So what's happened here is simply this: we all assumed that every single institution that's around us, the schools, the universities, the banks, the law, the courts, medicine, the doctors, that they're all fundamentally intact.
Right.
But the problem is, it's kind of like if you introduce the HIV virus into a body, right? You don't need a lot of it. You just need a little bit to corrupt the system. All of a sudden, everything falls apart. And remember my conversation at the beginning, the first point I made, which is always going to be salient, is that the easiest people to fool are the people who are the smartest.
Yes.
Because people who are smart, when they listen to their supposedly credentialed colleagues, they assume the truth is being told. And that's where the asymmetry is set up. Right. So if you want to pull one over on people, you get one shot. And that's what they did. They pulled one over everybody. And now the next time, if there's even a real legit one, let's just assume for a hypothetical case, and there's an actual terrible disease that comes out, nobody's going to believe it.
I'm terrified of that, because it's not like this couldn't happen and this thing couldn't have been like an absolute monster.
Yeah, well, and here's again, I've seen your wife's credentials in her Twitter profile. I didn't realize what she was. I saw an episode of her podcast, so I've started to become familiarized with her work. And here's the thing: for guys like you and me, our defense is this, right? She's got brains. We have pattern detection, right? We look for patterns, and one of here's the patterns we see, right?
Yeah.
You know what? Everybody stay home, stay locked down. Is a pandemic. Ooh, BLM riot. Rally. Riot. Mask off. I'm sorry, Freudian slip. That's okay. Oh, hold on. Sorry, what? It's okay. How did that become okay? You get what I'm saying? When you start to see that type of situation, the patterns don't require a PhD. You start to see it like, okay, I see what this is. When
you're giving me goosebumps right now listening to this, because it's exactly what I went through. Like, I started out with masks and gloves and wiping everything down because precautionary principle. I don't know what the hell this thing is. And then come June, July, I'm like, this is bullshit. Like I can't even. And then everybody else is starting to wear masks and going crazy. And I'm like, this is obviously not the thing we thought it was.
Well, there's that pattern to detect, to become alarmed by it. Then there's a second pattern. I don't know about you, but the way we survive in my country is it's family first, right?
Yes.
And that's and what I noticed for the first time, to my horror, is that families turn on each other. And it happened because of the news, because of COVID, right? They had people saying, I don't want that person, because they're not vaccinated, to come to whatever gathering or whatever thing. I don't want to even talk to that person because they're being selfish. Who do they think they are? Do they know more than the scientists, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm like, if my family does that, what am I supposed to expect of my friends or total strangers, right? And that's how they got that whole theme going, where they were talking about people who are unvaccinated can't come to the store. They should be fired from their jobs. We don't care if you're being selfish. If you come to the hospital, I, as a doctor who took the Hippocratic Oath, will not be treating you. It's like, whoa. First of all, let me linger on that Hippocratic Oath for a second. All right, so there's something insanely profound built into that concept. It's the idea of it's also the same idea of how young people get married. You're taking a risk. But the reason you're taking that risk that makes it worth it is you're saying, I'm all in, right? If you're a doctor and you take the Hippocratic Oath, what you're really saying is, I will put the needs of the person ahead of the needs of their actions or their ideology. I will treat Adolf Hitler if he's shot in front of me. Most people probably wouldn't, but a true Hippocratic Oath person would. That's the standard that they're supposed to uphold. That's why they get the respect they get in society. Not because they went to 8 years of medical school, because as you and I both know, you can go to a lot of schooling and kind of coast by and quote unquote get yourself a piece of paper.
Well, it reminds me of the joke. What do you call the person who came last in medical school? Doctor.
Exactly. Right. It doesn't matter because once you're there, you're there. It's sort of like when you see them. I don't know. I mean, I have friends who are in the military,
Yeah.
and they always look for that Ranger insignia. Right. When they see a Ranger insignia or they see a SEAL, it means something.
Yeah.
And what it means is, you know what, you earned what you got, and I know you couldn't get that just for free. There are
Right.
certain aspects of it, and it ties into Lori Loughlin and her little scandal friends trying to buy their daughters into school. Everything that we thought about with honor
Mm-hmm.
and respect, and the reason there's honor and respect, it usually comes from earning it. And I'll give you a
Yeah.
little story about that. So I have this, we have friends that we play little indoor beach volleyball for fun, like absolutely just for fun. One time we went in and there was a tournament there, and my buddies thought, hey, you know what, we should play. And I said, we're going to get destroyed. He goes, yeah, but we're going to learn. That's all right.
Yes.
So we signed up, and we played teams that we should have even won any games, but somehow miraculously we got into the finals. And when we got into the finals, there was this kid, and I'm telling you that he was like Superman. He could fly, and he was spiking it, and we were just eating dust. So I called the team over. I said, look, guys, here's what's going to happen. That guy is going to destroy us, and he's going to humiliate us. I said, yeah, it's kind of happening. What do we do? I said, let's do something nobody expects. Let's get 4 blockers on him. But that would require the guys in the back to be really quick in case he starts tipping it. But it's only for him. Everybody else, we can handle it. What do we got to lose? Everybody agreed. We played our hearts out. We won by a single point. We got so lucky, right? Now that medal, when it's hanging, it's just, we look at it and we remember the effort, the camaraderie, the flow that the whole team got into afterwards. We took showers, we went out to eat, we were talking about it, we were just, enjoying it. Now whenever we see each other, we always remember that instance. Now contrast that with my nieces and nephews. They see that medal. Oh, Uncle Ace, I have one just like it. Oh yeah, what did you get it for? Oh, we went out for a community walk and everybody got one. So I said, oh, this is the problem. When everything is equal, nothing is
Yeah.
of value, right?
Yeah.
There's a misunderstanding here. And so we look at doctors, and we all, up until just recently, I assumed, like everybody else, wow, you're a doctor. You are like the Navy SEAL of medical people, right? Like you went through a whole procedure and you have a devotion to helping people. And then you hear the way they talk to you. First question I ask you, how are you? How's it going? Did you get your shots? How many boosters did you get? It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Right? Let's take it back a few notches.
Yeah.
And it goes back to our initial salient point. The easiest people to fool are the people who think they're really smart. Because all it takes is a smart person to say something to them, and they go, oh, my cognitive ability is good. That guy's smart. I don't want to do all this calculation. Whatever he says is right. Because by default, if
Yeah.
I say something, I should be considered right.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
And this is where, I've talked about this on a couple of my podcasts, but like there's agreeable people and disagreeable people, and like most people like try to get along with those around them. You have we want to copy, especially high status people, and this is why
Yep.
the news is so effective. That
Yep.
these people in nice clothes are speaking clear English, are that have high status positions are telling you this thing, and sometimes that they're doctors, and
Yep.
it's takes a certain type of person to cognitively reject and analyze what they're saying, and it's very, very difficult.
It is. And my experience over the last little while has led me to believe to a small corner of planet Earth where this is still applicable.
Yeah.
And the small corner is the entrepreneurs. Because the entrepreneur's default position is to, even if you look at something that is working, the entrepreneur says, I could take it on. And a clear example of that would obviously in recent times would be the people who founded Netflix. Remember, they used to ship you DVDs from a box.
I remember that.
and standing against them was Blockbuster. And so even when things appear like they're good, we always have to assume that there's boundaries to that. And when those boundaries get tested and the context around them changes, you have a shot at renewal and revival, right? Most people see entrepreneurs as, whatever. It's like a odd person. I mean, obviously at this moment in time, everybody's taking their shots at Elon. Ironically, I'm like, you know what? You think you're his peer. He gets more done in an hour than you did in your entire life. I would be a little bit more cautious about throwing stones at that guy, but go ahead. It's all good. You know what? That guy's taken more shots negatively in terms of the bear market for Tesla bears than anybody in history. And he could take this on. So that's okay. But to our original point, when we see an entire medical community and we see the consistent failure right across the board, and we see that, okay, how much impact does pharma really have on medical schools, right? Pharma comes in, these are the drugs you should take. This is the hospital wing that pharma is donating, quote unquote, to. This is the school of X, Y, and Z, and you go in there. It's all you start to look at it, and you go back to that whole idea of the contagion. When you hire a CEO in a large corporation, a CEO and a founder are two different people, right? Yes. A CEO, his main qualifications for getting to where he is, 99% of the time, is because he understands one thing that other people will never do. He prioritizes making money over everything else. Yeah. And that's it. And now, if you put a person like that in charge and you say, okay, you prioritize making money over everything else, go exploit those opportunities. And they will. And when they do that, you shouldn't be surprised that their supposed goals of the corporation and yours don't line up anymore. Right. Because they're not interested in the same things you're interested in. A founder is a different type of person. Right. So Steve Jobs was a founder. And even though he was a CEO, his idea was that if you do the thing correctly, everything else will follow suit. Now, we're looking at Apple. We're looking at a transition. Tim Cook came in, learned a lot from Steve, but the next guy that's going to come in, you're going to have a product vision type of conversation. And here's where that problem leads to. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm telling you as an Apple investor what you should look for. Mm-hmm. So the greatest slice of growth in that company is not products and services. It's no longer their actual hardware that they built. So in that community of the VPs that are reporting to Tim, which is usually going to be the pool of candidates who are going to be up for election to take over the spot, are you really going to have a Steve Jobs or a Johnny Ive type person in that pool? Likely? No, not really, right? You're going to have a guy or a girl, whatever the case may be, whose interest is going to be solely on capitalizing opportunities in the market for making returns for the shareholders. Right. Because that's what that person is going to be chosen for. Now, unless the guys at Apple, hopefully they did this correctly, they set up a procedure in place where the succession plan has that the embedded DNA of Apple, which being, make the product, lead the way. That has to be the priority for how you select it. Unless that's there, we can immediately tell the next guy that comes in is going to coast for 5-10 years, take all the money, and then all of a sudden the company is going to get into a state of irrelevance. And that happens to large corporations all the time. Look at Microsoft. They're not in the conversation anymore, but they make way more money than they used to. Yeah. But they're not culturally appropriately fit into the conversation. Nobody talks about them. And Ballmer went and spent, I don't know, $8 billion to buy Nokia and $10 billion to build Windows into mobile, and nobody cares because it's not even around. Mm-hmm. Right. So that tells you that money, which I've always told people, you know what money gets you? It gets you a building and some cars. That's it. Yeah. Right. Because a factory or a company is essentially the pooling of resources, but that direction of where those resources are deployed has to be based on a vision. And so you get these people and they don't go anywhere.
I was having a conversation with somebody earlier today where I was trying to explain how optimization leads to fragilization. And this is, I feel like, what you're getting at here. And this is another thing that I learned from Taleb. And Joe Norman speaks to this very well, where when you have a system and you choose a single variable and you sacrifice everything else to go after that variable, inevitably the system starts failing in various ways that you maybe could see coming, but in many ways you won't see coming also.
Yes, 100%. To your point, your equation that you use to select those variables to optimize, the variables you left out are the ones that are going to come back to slap you in the face. You get what I'm saying? So it's one of those situations where you look at it, and I was talking to Paul and Mike on the last episode where we're talking about these ideas. And let me give you a clear-cut example of how this can go really, really badly. So what happened was a bunch of quote-unquote stats guys looked at the game of basketball, and they said, is there such a thing as the hot hand fallacy?
Yeah. I listened to that podcast, and this was fantastic. Please go on. I'm glad you're getting into my podcast too.
Yeah. So I wanted to share that idea, which was like, okay, there's a guy playing, and he's draining threes. He's got the hot hand, pass the ball to him. Everybody thinks that way, but the quote unquote statistician guys are like, no, that's not true. It's just a fallacy. So they looked at a bunch of data for about 1 year of the Boston Celtics, and they said, oh, according to the data, this is incorrect. Yeah. So everybody said, oh, statistics, data, science, sounds sciencey, sounds good.
I remember reading that and going like, yeah, it's not real.
Right, because again, we fell into the trap of assuming that somebody who claims statistics, science, and data, as soon as those words are thrown, what
Yeah.
ends up happening is they actually put you in a prison. The prison they put you in is the prison of assumption of what those words mean to you, when it could be the total opposite of it, right? If I said science to you, you assume hypothesis, testing, theory, validation, data, blah, blah, blah. But what if I don't mean it that way, right? You don't know that. So anyway, what happened was they said, yeah, according to the data, it doesn't pan out. But reality is it's actually far more complicated than that. So the way it works is, what if the other team noticed that, hey, you know what? This guy's draining threes. Let's go double up on him. Let's go triple up on him. Right? Let's
Yes.
go give him no room to do it. Let's give him a little bit of a hard foul. And on his way back for defense, what if he pulled a hamstring? Right? All those factors are completely removed from the equation, so you don't see those. It's kind of like the kid with volleyball, right? He was flying.
Yeah.
We threw in a variable he couldn't see, which was, what if we threw up 4 blockers at you? 4 is a lot more difficult to block against than 3, right? So you're going to have a difficult time. So the hot hand fallacy, and part of the, because I knew that story, that's how I came up with the idea of let's throw up 4 blockers. I said, listen, he's getting this easy because this is perfectly set up for him. Let's just switch it around. And so, same thing with the basketball analogy. And what the problem I have with that whole hot hand fallacy issue is that bit of knowledge that was improperly derived, poorly constructed, became fundamental truth for the next guy's assumptions. And they built all
Yes.
those other theories on top of that. And this is where you start to look at the whole idea of rationalia, and why, to take a little conversation in Neil Tyson deGrasse's direction.
Mm-hmm.
Let's create a planet called rationalia. Yeah, well, look where that's going to take you, right? As you start to abstract things, as you start to optimize for things that you think are actually correct, you're forgetting a couple of points of view. First of all, whatever you think is working bounded in space and time, and it's going to run into those boundaries very, very soon.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What looked like it was working in 2000 is not going to work in 2008 when the financial market collapses. What looks like, rationally, oh, look, here's my quant guy, here's my 50 servers, we're running the math on this, doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
And the reason it doesn't work, and I'm gonna make it very interesting for your users and listeners, is the following. Everybody follows these concepts based on game theory, right? So you model it out, and game theory tells you exactly what your opportunities are, but they forget that the market prices everything in. And so what we specialize in is we look at the concept of what's called the Kobayashi Maru. Have you heard of the Kobayashi Maru?
No, this is new to me.
Okay, so you're gonna love this. So this is basically an idea from Star Trek, right? So what
Okay.
they did was, as they're training cadets to become captains, they put them in a situation where they're supposed to have no wins. So essentially, you're supposed to die during the simulation as your ship is under attack. But James Kirk actually knew that was the setup. So what he did was he cheated against the cheat. So he went in and he hacked the program so that it doesn't turn out the way it's supposed to, right? So he pulled what's called the Kobayashi Maru. Now you might be asking yourself, okay, what does that have to do with reality, and how do we work with that? Well, think about it this way. Game theory assumes rational actors across the board.
Right.
Okay? Let's give you a perfect clear-cut example of how this could be gamed. So you're Vladimir Putin, and I'm the US president. You're going to sit there and you're going to say, okay, what do we know about Ace? Give me everything there is to know about Ace. I want to know where he grew up, everything that we could possibly get. Let's get all that information in. Now you've game theory modeled me out, right?
Mm-hmm.
I decide to adopt Donald Trump's tactics. I'm a madman. Now what happens, right? So now the Kobayashi Maru doesn't work anymore. Sorry, the game theory doesn't work anymore because I've just Kobayashi Maru'd you. I'm unpredictable, which means you can't predict what I'm going to do, which means you can't be on offense anymore. You have to play defense now. And the way that works is, the way you win at strategic games that are higher level is you don't give your opportunity for the opponent to play offense. You make them so worried about you that they're constantly setting up for defense. And that's how you create stability in certain situations. So if you and I are pulled in by cops, and you're being interrogated in one room and I'm being interrogated in another room, they're playing the game theory prisoner's dilemma model against us, right? So what I would tell you before we go rob that bank and say, hey, listen, Jeffrey, here's what we're going to do. Okay, when they put you in the room and they put me in the room, this is what they're going to try to do. Now, normally, the best bet is you don't say anything and I don't say anything. But that's what they want us, because that's what they're going to calculate into their heads. Let's do the opposite. I'm going to teach you what to say. And you're going to be like, okay, what do I possibly say to a cop that's interrogating me? Interrogate him. Whatever questions he asks you, assume that he's making up lies and say, wait a minute, how do I know what you're saying is true? I don't believe that. Show me the proof that you did that. Where's the camera? How fast was I going? Why did you pull me over? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you're Kobayashi Maruing the cop who's game theory modeling you.
I think I've actually seen a video of a guy do that, like in a police parking lot to a cop. Like he started accusing the cop of the same things that the cop, like, what are you here? Like, what are you here for? You know, it was hilarious.
Right. Because if you think about it, what the cop has been trained to do is has been trained to model you from a game theoretic point of view. If I ask you these questions, so the way I ask you that question is how I'm framing your point of view.
Yeah.
If I frame your point of view, and all of a sudden those words I'm using are words that are going to paint an image in your head, like, oh, you're going to be in the slammer, and oh boy, they're going to love fresh fish, right? That type of thinking in your head all of a sudden dilutes your capacity to think. And so I learned this watching Jordan Peterson with that Kathy Newman interview. So when she was questioning him, you noticed his shift. He kind of subtle. He sits back and he stares at it. He goes, "Oh, this is the game we're playing."
Yes.
So what he starts to do is he goes, "What do you mean by that question? What does this word mean to you?" Right. All of a sudden, what the person who thought they were on offense gets put back on the defense because now they have to go back and they have to try to quote unquote define their words. And if the person has ill intent, what will happen is if you ask them to define the words that they're using in their question, they either have to reveal their ill intent or they have to dodge you, in which case now their ego is going to be brought into check because they're going to feel like, uh-oh, my attack didn't work. All right. They're going to get frazzled and they're going to get in that uh-oh gotcha moment where they're going to realize that they got pulled one over them because they try to be, because as people engage with you in dialogue, the minute you detect that there's no good faith, stop answering, start asking questions. Yeah. That's the best thing to do. Right.
Yes.
Because now it's defense.
So that actually reminds me of Bill Clinton dealing with Kenneth Starr, where he's like asking the definition. What is the definition of "is" you're using?
Exactly. Right. And most people look at that and they think it's absurd, but look, it works very, very effectively.
It's brilliant.
It is. Because again, remember when the other person's questioning you, and 99% of the conversations you're ever getting involved in, the person asking questions is usually the person who's in a position of authority. Why is that? How do we know that's true? Well, it's simple. As a kid, when you do something wrong, who's asking you, what did you do?
Right.
It's your parents, right? Then you go to school and it's a test. The test is basically a set of questions provided to you by an authority figure and your teacher. If you go to the doctor's office, your doctor's asking, what's wrong? What did you do? Where does it hurt, right? So the minute somebody asks you questions, subconsciously in your mindset, you're automatically infantilized. You're the child. You're answering to the authority figure. Right. So if you know that going in, all of a sudden you go, pattern detection here. Let's exploit this asymmetry. This person wants to ask questions. I don't like the questions they're asking. I don't like their tone. I don't like their energy. I don't like their vibe. Let me flip it around on them. Right. And the first question you ask back is very subtle. You say, I'm sorry, I'm confused. What does this word mean exactly before I go on and answer it for you? And if they had bad faith as they were quote unquote interrogating you, the mask will fall right off the bat, because it takes a very highly trained person to know that, oh, wait a minute, he just took my shot and he returned it back in my direction. And they have to now engage in the second layer of deception to keep the game going. And most people aren't capable of doing that.
That's
the reason I know. The reason I know all this stuff is one of my uncles, when we were in Afghanistan, he was part of the, I guess at the time, what you could call the KGB variation.
Sure, intelligence agency sort of shit right here. Yeah.
Right. So his job to save his family before he could leave was to root out the enemy within the country, the ruling class that they didn't want part of it. And so he was brought in for training and he was taught these tactics, and he was told, never, ever, ever answer a question. Always ask a second question back. Right. And so it says, who do you think you, so here's the way that would role play out. So you come into the room and I'm interrogating you and I say, hey, where were you last night? And you ask me, I'm sorry, who are you? Right. As soon as I see that, I go, oh, he's been trained. So instead of that, I just say, who do you think you are? I'm the one who asks questions, not you. I'm going to ask you again. Where were you last night? Right. Yeah. So your little volley in my direction, I just recognize that, this guy knows what's happening. Let me flip the script on him. I turn it back into another question by reinforcing the idea that I'm the authority figure. And so these tactics work on human beings. And the way we know it works on human beings is this. We'll go back to COVID. You know what? We got to stop the spread. We got to flatten the curve. Look at our models. Our model says, if we don't do X, by the rate of growth, 50 things are going to happen and the number is going to explode and the hospital is going to crumble and we're going to fall apart.
Yeah.
Now, any journalist worth their salt, and I say this, and I say to this day, journalism died the way Christopher Hitchens died. Christopher Hitchens was the last journalist. that I remember who actually had the intellectual capacity and the moral courage to just stand up and say, "What? Who do you think you're talking to? That's not, I will not be put up.
A
I
giant
put this
among
in, I will
men.
put exactly right." So here's what happened. So I remember I had a conversation with a VC when I was pitching a company of mine, and I said, "Oh, here's our company. Here's our projections." He said, "Oh, stop! I don't care about your projections. None of that means anything to me." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Kid, do you understand how many projections I look at every day? And do you understand that almost none of them
Yeah.
actually come to truth?" I said,
Yeah.
"Oh," he goes, "I don't care about that." He goes, "Whatever your projections are maybe, I'm gonna divide it by 100, and then I'll consider it even then, because now you're asking me for my money, which means you're putting my game, my risk on the line. I'm not gonna take you at your word." So apply that same concept to, hey, the curve. Look at the number of cases.
Yes.
It's exponentially growing, right? Well,
Yes.
why should I assume that everything you're saying is gonna stay status quo and we're just gonna explode?
Yeah.
Right. And now the politicians were also playing this other sneaky game. Every time they brought the numbers down, it was our strategy and it was my brilliant thought and my science team told me this. But every time the numbers got bad, oh, it's you people. You people are bad. Right. So the asymmetry of power, that exploitation of authority figure to infantilize human being, was perfectly at play. But they had a second layer built into it, which was even more disgusting, which was they had the kid in school
Yeah.
who would tattletale on the other kids for walking in the hallway, right? The hall monitors. The number of hall monitors we got to see just boggles the mind. It's like, you know what, man? I get it, but what are you doing?
Yeah.
You walk into a coffee shop, guys. It's me. It's you. Nobody's here. Do you have a mask? Why? It's just you and me, man. Why do I need a mask? You're way over
Yeah.
there. There's literally a glass shield in front of you and me. Why do I need a mask? Oh, it's the rules. I said, is anybody recording this conversation? No. I said, tomorrow if they said, you know what, we're gonna replace you with a robot, do you think they'll care about you? Well, no. I said, then why do you care about me? Just give me my coffee and let me out of the door. I don't really, we don't need to have this conversation. We don't need to have this dialogue. I just want to get a cup of coffee. But if you're gonna make it this difficult for me, I'm just gonna leave, right? So again, you start to recognize that one of the ways you keep control is you empower the hall monitors in the school, because a teacher can't be everywhere, right? And one of the crazy hall monitors they have now for you, which was insane when I saw it, was, oh, we're gonna have this app built into iOS and Android that's going to contact tracing or whatever they call it. At the time, I was like, wow, hall monitoring taken to the next level, right?
Well, it's like you take these people, and what I found is the people who think of themselves as victims were far more likely to feel as though that this thing was going to, be a danger to them, right? And that people around them who weren't playing by the rules were victimizing them. And then you take it a step further, and like you're saying, give them this power to retaliate against these people who are victimizing them.
Yeah, and exponentially made it worse. Not only do I give you the power to retaliate, I'm going to give you the moral high ground to do so.
Yes.
Now you're morally righteous and you're vindicated from a moral point of view.
From only you're the smart person, you're the righteous, correct person who's saving everybody, and you get to be this hero by trying to impose your will on everybody else.
Correct. It's tribalism at its worst, right? And the problem with that type of situation, when I see people who think that way, I'm very live and let live as my philosophy. I don't really say anything to people. I'm like, you know what? Again, I learned this from Paul Portersey. He had this concept called let it trade, right? On Wall Street, you pick a bet on a stock, I pick a bet. You have to let me trade, so I have to let you trade. Otherwise, we can't participate in the markets. But reality will settle the score at the end of the day. So when I see a person who and I look at it, I was with my mom. We were in the elevator. This was about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, and this person wouldn't get on the elevator because the two of us were in the elevator.
Yeah,
and this person almost seemed angry at the fact that there were two other people in the elevator. So my mom looked at her and she said, "Wow, this person is really cautious." I said, "No, that person is going to be suicidally depressed."
Yes.
She said, "That's quite a jump to make." I said, "No. If that person is unable to do what they're doing now, what they're telling you, they're signaling to you that they're in so much pain that they can't trust anybody.
Yeah.
That means that person has alienated, I guarantee you, half their family for sure.
Yep.
If not more. right? And
Yep.
every once in a while we see that person and we start to notice the signs of a lonely person. You could always pick that up on somebody. If somebody's lonely and they're depressed, you could see it. You could
Yeah.
you could almost smell it, right? And because they've doubled down so hard and they've made the gravest sin of all, right, which is the sin of rejecting family.
Yep.
And if you do that, then what ends up happening is, people don't recognize this, but it's very, very simple. If I see you rejecting your own family and I'm your friend, I know I have no shot at your loyalty whatsoever. There's no way. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But if that's your blood and you're doing that to your blood, what am I?
I've been on both sides of that equation before. I've made the mistake of rejecting family, and I've had family reject me also. I think it's something that you work through, but I know, I know what you're talking about. It resonates.
Right. And here's the funny part of that is that it shouldn't, because we didn't get to this far. We didn't survive multiple generations to this point by rejecting family. And our tribes that were so small, just to sort of give you an idea, right? So for you to be born, you needed 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. And when you go to the 9th level, you needed 2,048 groups of people, right? That's a lot of numbers. For that to happen, and if you didn't have trust, that was implicit to the point where it was blind, and you required that blind level of trust. And to certain groups, you need that to survive. If you don't have that built in, somebody's cracked an armor in your system. Yes. And they've let, it's a small backdoor to software in software terms. I'll give you an example of how you could do something like that. So sometimes when you write data into a hard drive or an SSD or whatever, there's little buffers, little spaces where you can add extra data that's padded to allow for the amount of the data for the word to be fit in. What somebody at the NSA could do is they could say, okay, not all the words that are written are going to match that length. The computer's going to actually just inject some buffer into that. Yeah. What we could do is we can actually calculatedly inject a specific amount of data across the memory that will, if you string it along, it actually turns into a command that we can use as an exploit to take over the control.
An overflow attack, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Something of that sort. Now you look at that and you say, okay, if I can separate you from the family, right, where lions are hunting, what do? They separate you from the herd, right? That's when you become isolated and you become weak. If we can get you to turn on your family, you are now dependent on the state.
Yes.
Period.
Yes.
End of discussion.
And I got to tell you that realization and what you're saying right now is possibly the most important revelation that I've had in the past decade. And that, I used to be a leftist, socialist, utilitarian type, right? Like thinking that you can, of the Sam Harris sort of persuasion, where you think that there's a correct answer that can be calculated out there, right? That's better for everybody, which I now think is hogwash. It's absolutely poisonous thinking, and that there's always going to be, now I believe there's always going to be conflict, and that you need to have your tribe, so to speak, your family and friends who have your back and you have theirs. And it's been quite a revelation. And to build off that even more, it's like this kind of thinking is built in. And I was a former atheist who now, I believe in religion strongly now, because this is kind of a theme for my podcast also, of what truth is that truth, this is truth itself, because truth itself requires survivability. And and it's not just genetics, like my wife studies, that has naturally selective properties, but ideas themselves. And then it's like the combination of ideas and genetics in concert that have survivability properties.
100,000%. And I'll bring a point to that to tie it home to you. It's the idea that, when you look at a rectangle, a rectangle, what's important, the length or the width? The answer is both. You need both, right? Yeah. What's important, genetics or environment? Both. The minute you try to emphasize one over the other, you've lost the plot. And to tie it back to your other point with Sam Harris, ironically, the man who rails against tribalism and other things he attacks on he relies on his Patreon tribe to keep him financially afloat, so he can do what he's doing, right?
Yeah, for sure.
The irony's not lost. We watched that, and you know, just to give you an idea, just to give you a clue of how bad this was for me. Back in early around 2000 and I would say 6, 7, me and a friend of mine, we actually started the first Afghan atheist group on Facebook.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. So that led. I mean, you talk about, you know, I was a fan of Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens. I still put aside. As
Hitchens is a different character.
Yeah, that guy's different. I'll put him in his own league. But the other guys, you know, Dennett, Harris, you know, I read all their books. I was massively a fan of theirs, and I always had a problem believing Islam as a kid. I remember I was in grade 7, and I was forced by my father to go to Islamic school on Saturdays, which as a kid, there's nothing worse than more school, right? So right off the bat, it was poorly framed for me. And I've never been a morning person. And this morning class started at 7 a.m. Right. So it's like, you know what, all the odds are stacked against this kid to survive this school. And I remember I went into school, and that same Friday, we had a class in science, and my teacher was explaining how malaria spreads, right? So you know, cut the next day, we're sitting in class, and the teacher's explaining that God has thought everything through, and one of the things he's thought through is how a mosquito filters and cleans your blood, so that if one person gets bitten, the other person doesn't get sick. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I said, hold on a second. I asked her, I said, you know, I have a question. She goes, what's the question? I said, I just learned yesterday how malaria spreads. Can you reconcile these two for me, right? She couldn't really do it on the spot. She said, I'll talk to you after class. After class, she went in, called up the quote unquote principal of the school, who happened to be a friend of my father. So you could imagine how this is all working out. I was branded the troublemaker. I was expelled from that school. You know, I used to spend all the day looking for, I would find excuses. Oh, I got to go pray. So I'd leave the classroom and walk around and try to find new friends and do silly things with it. So my rejection of this idea of authority, it was always innately built into me. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Right? And so when we came to Canada, same thing happened with regards to the political ideology. So when you say you are left, trust me, if anybody knows, it's me. You start there, and
we have very similar lineages from the sound of it, at least intellectually.
Exactly. Right. So we process the information, and we get to a stage now where it's like, you know what? Here's the problem, right? The problem is you're a finite being, and you think you understand the infinite universe.
Yeah.
And there's your lack of humility right there. And that's why I said that when they say the devil plays tricks and the easiest people to fool are the people who are the smartest, is because if you can be convinced that your computer in your brain is better than everybody else's, and that you could compute what the universe is versus everybody else is too dumb, I can trick you into pretty much doing anything I want you to do.
Yes.
You get what I'm saying? So that lack of humility is massively, and that it's not fun. I think, and this is a thought experiment, I want you to consider this. Pre the new atheist movement, I think it would have been a lot harder to sell this pandemic. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. Now, obviously, there's lots of other factors. There's social media involved, the contagion that you could spread through social media, and the quote unquote fact checkers and all the nonsense that's going on over there in that space. Compound that with the whole atheist movement of the rejection of religion because people who are religious are stupid. All those things that we all thought were true. None of it is true. It turns out that a lot of it is actually just stored wisdom that's lost its ability to be translated. The only person I've found recently who could translate that wisdom with any degree of depth is Jordan Peterson.
Yes. He was one of the people that put me on this track, like listening to him and his discussions of religion, in terms of, and just that the pragmatism of truth is really just what set in my mind, like in this direction.
Yeah. Right. And so this is what I'm talking about. It's like nobody really articulated those points of view. I would have loved a conversation between him and Hitchens. That would have been like probably,
oh my God, it would have been amazing.
It would have been, because I actually went to see a live debate between Hitchens and Tony Blair. It was like absolute trashing. But to point back out to the whole idea back in 2007 when we started the Afghan atheist movement. There's a reason why I'm not on camera, and the reason is because I was actively encouraging Afghans to first of all, you know, if you leave Christian religion or Judaism, it's not such a big deal. If you leave Islam, it is considered punishable by death. Now, take that to the level where you're not only left it, but you're encouraging other people to leave it. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, yeah.
That's me and my buddy, who ran the Facebook page for a good number of years. We used to, because he lived in Germany, I lived in Canada.
How old were you at the time?
I was probably 17 years old.
Oh, the
Yeah,
ignorance
yeah, it
of
was
youth right there.
so much ignorance, so much, oh, I know everything. I've read, the moral landscape. Come debate me, right? That type of disgusting mindset. Then now I look back and I'm like, you know what? I get it.
Yep. Yep.
It's a phase. We all go through it.
Yep.
But it means that you're learning, right? You're reading, you're acquiring new knowledge. Whatever was status quo around you, you don't accept and adapt to it. That's fine. But what was happening was, um, there was this whole movement against those sort of ideas within the Islamic community, simply because, as bad as religion is in the West, when it gets to this extreme deformed variations of it, the Islamic variation is almost always worse, right? Because it's so much more oppressive in terms of how it and I think the reason why it's oppressive is it doesn't explain why it's telling you to do what it is telling you to do. Like, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a clear
Yeah.
cut example. To this day, I've never gotten really good answer for it. So there's this a holy month of Ramadan where the Muslims fast, right?
Yep.
And that's the reason they fast, is because during that month, the Holy Quran was supposedly revealed to Muhammad, and
Yeah.
as a celebration of it, he is asking people to fast. And depending on where you read all the literature and which Muslims you talk to, I talk to both sides of it, and I'll tell you why that's interesting in a minute. Is what they tell you is, oh, Muhammad initially was going to ask everybody to fast for 9 months, but he talked with God, and now it's down to 30 days. I said, okay, that's
Hell of
fine.
a salesman right there, that
Right?
Muhammad.
Hey, we brought it down from 9 to 1. You should be grateful for it. So
Steve
I
Jobs
asked,
would appreciate that little
right?
trade
That's how
off.
he would have secured that music streaming deal a lot sooner if he had Muhammad doing it for him. But to give the devil his due, the argument was that you do this because it's good for you. So I said, okay, what
Yeah.
exactly is it good for me for? They said, well, one of the things you could do is you could empathize what it's like to be poor and not
Yeah.
have food, and then you'll be a lot more compassionate towards. And again, remember, I was in grade 7. Okay,
Yeah.
so I asked my teacher. I said, if I was poor and starving, instead of you empathizing with me by starving yourself and being thirsty, I would really appreciate if you just shared your food with me, right? Like, why wouldn't you just share
Yeah.
your food and give me some of it so that I'm not hungry too? We both don't
Yeah.
need to be starving. That's a better way for you to empathize, right? So to this day, that argument of, oh, you need to empathize with the poor by being poor and hungry yourself, I'm like, you could do better. You could just feed them some of your food.
Yeah. But now, do you think that you have come to an understanding of why? I mean, so clearly Islam is a very successful religion, and it has stood the test of time. And
Yes.
in that way, it is
Yeah.
true for the people who practice it. Have you been able
100%.
to square away, like, maybe one of these observations about Ramadan and the fast with, like, why it's effective?
I have to a certain extent. Like I said, I always tried to steelman the opposing point of view.
Yeah.
So I know that it's good. Fast. I fast now. I
Yeah.
just and I do it every day. What I mean by that is I there's an 8 hour window during which I eat. Other than that, I'm usually not eating anything. So I recognize the benefits of that, because I look at food as information. Information has to be digested and incorporated into the system. If you're constantly bringing new information in, it's like, I want you to think, but while you're thinking, I want you to stream through a YouTube video playing in the background and constantly reading Twitter. That's too much information for you to process, right? It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You need time to read something, walk away, think about it, digest it, so it's actually properly incorporated into your systems. Think of food in the same way. That's how I do it anyway. It doesn't mean that you have to, but that's just my thought process behind it. But
Mm-hmm.
the problem with the Islamic version of it, and again, somebody somewhere is always going to get offended. Knock yourself out if that's what you want to do. Here's the deal. The problem with the Islamic version of it is this. What they do before they start their fast is they get up early in the morning
Mm-hmm.
and they eat like 5 meals worth of food, right? And it's like, I have to really eat a lot so that I'm not hungry during the day. And then during the day, you're doing something that's really detrimental in my point of view, which is that the lack of water, right? So it's not
Yeah.
just the fact that you're not having food, it's you're also depriving your body of water, which I think that the health benefits of fasting are heavily negated if you say, okay, it's like, imagine you're living in Qatar, for Christ's sake, or
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia. And it's like, I don't know, 70, 80 degrees out there. It's hot. It's like hot for like 16 hours a day. And you're not eating food. No problem. You could manage that, but you're not drinking water. And you're doing lots of heavy work. And now the way I tested that for myself, because again, I was always one of those people. When I was old enough to do the fast, I decided, you know what, I'm going to do a CBC count. So a little blood work. I wanted to see what my blood looked like before I started this process, and I did it after. I noticed there's a deterioration, right? Because the lack of water during the day was negatively impacting my health because of the way I was being taught how to fast. Now, the Muslims around you will say, well, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do X, Y, and Z. I said, okay, great. Einstein, listen, I did it the way my family does it, the way my community does it, and that's what's normal to us. So if it's wrong, somewhere somebody diluted the process and said this is how you should really fast. But up until this day, any Muslim you ask during their Ramadan time, they won't drink water. And you say to them, and I've always said, okay, put my arguments aside. Why don't you do this? Get a blood test going for yourself a month before Ramadan. Do the fasting as if you were going to do it, but drink water during the day. Do another blood test and see the results. After, then do the Islamic version of it, where you don't eat and you don't drink, and then do a blood test again for your own body. Forget my words. I'm just some guy on the internet, right? What do I know? Do it for yourself. And then once you see those results, you start to think to yourself, am I really doing myself any good here? Right. And now that turns into that spiritual conversation, which is like, well, I'm punishing myself for my sins.
Right.
Okay, that's a different conversation. If you're into masochism, that's entirely up to you. I'm not here to judge. If for you, some people, and it's tied deeply into it, as if they feel like they've been engaged in sin, and most of us have been engaged in various sins of the flesh, as we say.
Certainly.
Right. So for those groups, if your atonement requires that you punish yourself, by all means, have at it.
Yeah.
Right. Again, my argument is let it trade. Do you, right? That works.
Right.
Have fun. I can't come back to it. I just seen too much.
I mean, I think
doesn't appeal to me.
In Judaism, I believe there's a concept that I'm no expert on these things at all, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But it's like if you have to work on the Sabbath, like you understand, it's like as long as you're doing something where you understand that you're honoring the point of the Sabbath, while making the decision, that is, that's still a godly thing to do.
Yes. I take a different spin on that whole work 6 days, rest on the seventh day. What that really means, and again, this is one interpretation, so please don't crowd the comment section with various name calling. But here's what it means, right? So the world around you is always in a state of decay.
Yeah.
To maintain, you have to work at least 4 days a week. Right. Otherwise, you're gonna try running a business and working 4 days a week. Maybe you'll get it to supposedly stay where it is. If you want it to thrive, you got to push it 6 days a week. Yeah. And that 6 days is the difference between. And again, I think about it from Elon's point of view, right? He always says, "Look, people work 8-hour days. I work 16-hour days, and 1 week I get more done than you do in 2 weeks." If you multiply that math out by a year, you'll see how much further ahead I am than you.
Yeah.
Right. Take the same idea and say, okay, what if, just for argument's sake, for 1 month, I worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and took the 7th day to just completely rest.
Yeah.
Now, I took a spin on that idea, and I said the way I do it, based on I run a software company called Moonlit. What I usually do is I will work 16 hours, and then I'll just sleep until I'm fully rested, and then I'll wake up and I'll restart the clock again. Now, that doesn't always translate to perfect 16-hour blocks, but what it does do is that it actually allows me to adapt my system and my body to my work and my goals. Get what I'm saying? So in that regard, the whole 6 day working, God rested on the 7th day, that's essentially what the prescription is talking about, which is that if you want to succeed in the face of ever-changing reality, you have to be engaged at this level if you want to create a new nation, right? That's the whole creating nation of Israel, God's land, God's city, all that stuff. What they're saying to you is if you want to create a new life for yourself, you're going to have to put this into it, because that's your new city. Right, that's where you're going to inhabit the force of divinity,
and it's almost like a religious prescription, that's true on multiple levels. Like it's the avoiding of the over optimization problem, where you're maximizing work and you're fragilizing everything else. It's like God is telling you, in order to avoid system failure in some unpredictable way, take some time off, get your head about you.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting because one of the ideas behind that is the idea of Sufi poetry, which is heavily influences my mind, which is that to appreciate beauty, you need context, and the only way to add context in your life is to add time. What that means is just time to do nothing. Right?
Yeah.
Just let everything you brought. Think about it this way: you bought a brand new house and now you're decorating, right? So you and your wife, I'm sure, has better taste than you, because most of
she does.
Right? So she decides that she's going to say, you know what, this is the couch we're going to buy, these are the paint things, this is the rack, all that stuff. So she's constantly buying, and you never sit down to just enjoy her company on a morning sunrise to view the room you're in, right? But you're constant. Imagine if you just kept all the time adding stuff. Oh, fix this, vacuum that, clean this, clean that. What's the point of all the work that you just did?
Right. For sure.
Right? So you're not going to enjoy it, A, but B, you're not going to see your mistakes, because sometimes to see a mistake, you need time.
You know, I go to Burning Man and I help run a pretty big camp that we put a lot of work into. And I'm one of the first people to get into the desert on playa, as they like to say. And I start setting up all this stuff for a 150, 160 person camp. And we're working under very difficult circumstances, with the heat and the wind and so on and so forth. And almost every year for the past few years I've done it, one of my happiest and most joyful points is that I just go up on this tower and I chill out and I watch everybody else who's not building, the city start to come in, and these amazing things that I didn't help build most of them, but I built this part, and just look over the landscape and go like, wow, this is amazing. It's a thing to be a part of. And it came from nothing basically in the
Right.
time that I was there.
That's fantastic. But here's what's interesting about that. The minute you do that, you're actually subconsciously informing yourself for what you want to create next year when you participate.
Oh,
Because
you
got to see,
couldn't be
right?
more right. Yeah, I mean the last time I went, I gave a brief speech. That I don't think most of the people in camp really appreciated, but the guys who build it with me really did. Is that we build this for so we can tear it down, so we can build it again. And
Right.
it's the
Iteration.
ephemeral nature of that, and the incredibly difficult circumstances in which I'm working with these guys who I truly love to make this sort of temporary city where the impossible happens every year. And if it was just a permanent thing, it wouldn't have that same sort of experience all the time.
Right. Right. No, no. Again, sometimes there's a guy on YouTube. He has a cooking channel. It's like the 100-hour brownie, or like the 100-hour.
Yeah.
Honestly, he takes like 100 hours to cook some brownies or lasagna or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
And his main ingredient in his dishes are time.
Yeah.
Right. And you start to think to yourself, the entirety of modernity is built around compression of time. Right. When you compress
Yes.
time, you also lose information. Entropy
And
becomes increased.
and hey, what was it? It was Hagen. Though I'm looking at my notes we're an hour in, and I'm looking at my notes for the first time, so that's awesome. Um,
So
it
we
was
didn't do the
Jonathan
Antonio
John
Brown.
Higgins.
Mm,
Higgins,
mm.
which is he the one that talked about that?
I don't think I'm not quite sure if it's him, so I don't want to.
Okay,
I'm just going to plead ignorance on that one. I
keep
don't really
going.
know. No, but what I was going to say to you is that the whole idea of it goes back to that basketball analogy with regards to the data abstraction. When you abstract, when you optimize, you lose information, right? That's the problem, right? So nature gives you information, and you decide to optimize something, which means from that information nature was giving you, what seemed like noise in state one could actually be signal in state two. And
Mm,
if you start to abstract layers upon layers upon layers, what starts to happen is what you're dealing with is pure noise, but it looks like signal to you because it came from state A. And state B, you won't be able to recognize it. So I'll give you an example of how that applies. Okay, you're the CEO of Intel. Your name is Paul Ottolini. I'm Steve
mm-hmm.
Jobs. I come to you, say, hey, listen, I need you to make me a CPU for this phone. You go, all right, no problem, Steve. We'll go look into it. And you go talk to every single person on your team that's got the MBAs and all that stuff. And they come back and they say, yeah, there's no market for this. Right? This is 2006, right? So there's no market for this supposed cell phone that's going to be requiring a CPU that's efficient. Now, why did that happen? Well, because you're looking at data points bounded in space pre-iPhone, right? You don't
Mm-hmm.
see the data points because, again, remember this whole idea of, oh, I need this thing to be peer reviewed. I need data, data, data. Okay, great. You know, when the tsunami hits, there's no data point that predicts what's
Yeah.
coming, right?
Yep.
Sometimes a single piece of information is so big that it changes the context of the boundary of the space you were in.
Fat
So
tail
you're
distributions.
exactly right. So the fat tail shows up in that. So if you're Paul Ottolini and you're at Intel, Steve gave you an opportunity to be in the next wave, and you declined because your MBAs told you there's nothing there for you.
Yeah.
Right? You missed that ride. Now, the only thing that was left on the modern smartphone that you have in your hand, the only thing Intel contributed to that is the USB port. Everything else is not from them anymore. They're no longer a player in that game,
Right.
right? Because they're stuck. And and again, this concept of path dependence, which we learned, is the idea that if you wash your shirt and then you iron it, that's cool. If you iron your shirt and then you wash it, doesn't work so well. If you're building chips for Microsoft Wintel, which is the thing that brought you to the dance, 30% of the chip die is designed for APIs that Microsoft needs for Windows to operate, and Microsoft does not and will not cut those APIs out of the equation. That's why you could run a Windows 98 program on Windows 11. So your Intel, you're stuck. This is the cell that they gave you. This is that word science that they told you.
Yeah.
And now you can't move past this, right? And so this idea that you're always looking at things from the point of view of I need data, I need validation, I need peer review. I always tell people, I'm like, if you're a cutting edge thinker, you don't have peers. Who's going to peer review you?
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You're Einstein, and you're going to change the way physics is done. Nobody's peer reviewing you. And
right.
and here's where it's interesting. All right, so let's think about it this way. You walk into a physics classroom at MIT. You're sitting among some of the smartest people on planet Earth. Yes or no? Probably.
I mean, it's certainly the wittiest and quickest.
Right? So here's what's interesting. Now, if I was to sit in that class, I can assure you that I'd probably fail. Right? It's not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
Now, there's somebody in there that could sit in that classroom that could actually understand the material well enough to pass. There's going to be a guy next to him who's going to understand it so well that he's going to do great. There's going to be somebody there who's going to understand it to the point of view where he can write the textbook out in his head.
Yeah.
But once in a generation, there's going to be a guy in there who's going to say, this is all wrong. And he's going to leap past it. Now, that guy doesn't have peers.
Right.
Right. And the way our world changes is when that guy who doesn't have peers shows up. And I'll give you an example of it right now, which people are not paying attention to. It's going to seem obvious after the fact, but look at Elon and look at Starlink, right? What Elon actually did with Starlink is he's reinvigorated the idea of real estate. Because now for the first time on Earth, you can move wherever you want and you can have access to the internet, which is what usually draws people back from going anywhere.
Huh. Yeah. I mean, that makes a ton of sense. I was a poker player for a little while, and one of my fantasies was that like I was going to just have a van and play online like poker. And one of the limits was that I couldn't get a connection like 10 years ago when I wanted to try and do this.
Right. So think about it this way, right? So real estate markets, I mean, in Toronto, it's insane. You don't even ask, right? It's so bad.
Oh, yeah.
Now you look at it, you're like, Canada's a massive piece of real estate. Geographically speaking, largest landmass out there. Parts that were basically uninhabitable before because you just needed to stay connected. And the reason I tell that to people, I say, every single one of us is a commuter these days. Just we commute digitally. You go to the office digitally. This is us right now. We're commuting digitally. Right.
Yep.
This couldn't be done, and so large parts of the land were basically uninhabitable because you just couldn't get there. But now you look at it and you say, okay, Starlink comes out. You and your wife each get a Starlink account. Then you get a switch at a home that actually has dual ports, so you can connect both of them in. Now you have the speed of both Starlink satellites connected to one system. That's faster than most people's internet at home anywhere you go.
Is it really that good?
It is good. It's really, really that good. Now, again, caveat to be taken into account is that obviously if the weather's bad, you're probably going to have some issues. But it went from I have no internet to I have internet, right?
Yeah.
And now I have really fast internet. That's a big change. Now, when that starts to propagate and people start to recognize that, you know what, I could just live further out and it's cheaper to buy a house out there, which means I can actually start to own equity, which means I could actually start to become financially independent relative to being in the rat race in the city. That's a change. That's one data point that actually flips the entire conversation. That's phase shift from old context, pre-iPhone, to new context. Oh, every smartphone now looks like the iPhone.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So those type of phase changes, that's the asymmetries that I'm always looking for. It's like what's happening here that's entirely different than what used to happen. Because what we're human beings, our natural inclination is map what you see against what you already know. Right? It's not true. The world doesn't work that way. The world works in a much more complex way. In the way it unfolds, opportunities show up that you never saw coming, and it's only obvious after the fact. Right? Which is why, and here's where I find that the arrogance of it hilariously easy to spot, which is that every single person these days who is engaged in what we call presentism, the idea that I'm going to judge George Washington because he owned slaves.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I'm like, listen, you probably can't do 2 push-ups, right? And you live in your mom's basement, and you think you're so incredibly smart that for the vast majority of human history that nobody's thought what you just thought. Right. And the reason you think what you think is not because you're a genius, it's because that's what's been built around you, right? You're living in that water that's been cleaned and filtered, and you think all water should have been cleaned and filtered. Yes. Meanwhile, if you lived 500 years ago, or if you lived 100 years ago, hell, if you lived 50 years ago, you probably would have been one of those racist people who actually hit black people on the streets. So please get off your moral high horse And let me tell you another story. You're not
Mhm.
actually on a moral high horse. You're actually on a donkey and you're riding it backwards. You just think you're on a moral high horse, right?
Well, it's the benefits and the comfort that have been unearned by the people who have them, that don't understand the things that were required to survive in previous days. It's like the largesse that we live in that are on the backs of everybody who came before us, that are all of a sudden these moral monsters.
Yeah, that's hilarious because, like I said to you, think about we discussed earlier with regards to how many grandparents and nth generation grandparents you had to have just to be born.
Yeah.
And my culture, the reason I know this viscerally a lot more effectively than most people around me is this, right? I come from a province in Afghanistan that had the Northern Alliance built into it. So we were the only
Okay.
people who fought the Taliban before the Americans came in. The
Yeah.
leader of the Northern Alliance, his name was Ahmad Massoud. His team single-handedly was fending off the Taliban for years before the Americans came. When the Americans came, they basically the Taliban sent in a camera crew to interview Ahmad Massoud, and they put a bomb in one of the cameras, and that's how they killed him. Right?
Oh,
Right. Now, that same province to this day is actually where the resistance continues. Even after Kabul fell, that province in Panjshir, which is the reason it works is it's geographically locked. When the winter
yeah.
comes, you're not going to survive there because it's mountainous, it's crazy cold, and
Yeah.
if you're going to go and you're going to survive and you're going to put up a resistance, and I hate that word because Twitter ruined it, but if you're going to put up a resistance, that's where you put it up. Now, the reason I know that and I recognize that fact is that people who live under those circumstances, sleeping 3-4 hours a night, traveling constantly, engage in various issues of battle, literally for life and death. The
Yes.
lessons you learn from that are totally different from, oh my God, I went into Yogan Fruits today and they didn't have my flavor. I feel so oppressed, right? It's like the contrast couldn't be more. And the level of contempt that you can generate from just recognizing that couldn't be more. But you also recognize the fact that, you know what, this is beautiful. I have a closer link to reality than you do.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows me to arbitrate the information that's coming in and bet against you. And so I'm going to exploit that asymmetry of information. Now, at the same time, I want to help you. I want you to recognize how easy it is for you to get to the situation I'm in, which is I'm going
Yeah.
to lay out Dostoevsky's point of view, which is that the devil has one thing he cannot do, which is he can't be grateful. If you are
Oh,
grateful, right, he can be everything. He will never be grateful.
right.
And one of the tricks to detecting people who you shouldn't really get in bed with, and I mean that in multiple ways,
Yeah.
is that if they can't show great gratitude, right?
Right.
That means their level of entitlement is so deeply ingrained that they think they're God on earth, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the devil does. Every single sin is possible. One thing that cannot be done is to show gratitude.
I was certainly possessed by that problem for a number of years, was the lack of gratitude for where I was, and you know life has a way of humbling you though over the
Of
time.
course, of course, and I tell people all the time, and again, I'm in the same boat as you, right? I had that same when I had my
Yeah.
first startup company. I couldn't have been more of a tech bro, arrogant piece of trash. You couldn't, if you took all the epithets of what that tech bro means and all the negative connotations with it, you couldn't possibly package that into something that would remotely come close to what I was. Right. But
Yeah.
reality has a way of humbling you, as you said.
Yeah.
But I realized after the fact, I said, you know what? There's a lot of strength if you recognize that before the fact. If you're humble enough to start with gratitude, to say, look, and to your point earlier about the whole idea of being a staunch atheist, the way I broke out of mine was I had three really bad trips. One with
Mm.
LSD, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
two with LSD and one with shrooms. And here's what happened.
Okay.
So when I took the LSD, uh, I had a difficult relationship growing up with my father. So my father
Mm-hmm.
was corporal punishment leaning. Let's just
Yeah.
put it lightly that way. Okay. And
Yeah.
so in our culture, that's essentially how they discipline children.
Yep.
Now, one of the things I learned is if you hit a child, you know what happens really, really quickly? A child learns how to lie because to
Mm.
avoid pain, they'll lie.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if you're a liar, that's good. It helps you avoid pain. But if you're smart and you're a liar, you start to believe in your own lies. Right.
Yeah, man, that's for sure.
Right. So I took the LSD trip, and I did it not because I know I'm interested in drugs or whatever. I was like, I just need that shamanic experience because I keep reading about this stuff. I
Mm-hmm.
need to know what that's all about. So I took the largest dose I could get, and I just wanted one trip. I was like, I'm not interested in doing this multiple times. I just want to do it one time. So I took all I had, and I took one shot at it, and I quote unquote had that out of body experience. And to most people, that could be like another delusion of your ego. Sure, absolutely. But here's a lesson I drew from that. The lesson I drew from that was I had a conversation with the universe, so to speak. And the universe said, every time you tell a lie, it's like you're swiping your credit card to the universe. We'll let you do it. No problem. Just remember when the bill comes due that you're going to have to pay it.
Mm-hmm.
So the lies you're telling eventually saturate your own soul to the point where you can't even see the truth anymore because you believe in your own nonsense too much. As an entrepreneur, but part of being a salesman, and I always tell, me and Mike Driver, we have this conversation all the time. There's very little difference between a salesman and a con man.
Yeah.
The only difference is one doesn't do it to take advantage of you. He could, right. He just doesn't do it. So I took that bad LSD trip and I saw the ledger for all my lies. And I said, okay, I got to get off this path, right? This is not working for me. I can't pay this off if I continue down this road. So I walked away from that and I was shaken to my atheist core, so to speak. And I said, okay, that was one bad trip. So, listening to Terrence McKenna, listening to Sam Harris and all these other guys, I said, okay, let's try the shrooms approach. So I took the magic mushroom trip. And that one was about being lazy. And what it did was it took me to the door path of hell, right at the doorstep. And what I saw there was this, right? So what I saw there was the very moment before my parents die, like their last breath. And they look at me and they say, look what we left for you and look what you've done with it because you were lazy. Right? So as they're walking into hell and I'm standing at the gate and I'm like, okay, we had a castle. Wow. They left that for me. And I've been so lazy and I've been so ungrateful for what I've been doing with my life here. This is the second lesson I had to learn.
I had a very similar mushroom trip, man.
It shakes you, right? All of a sudden, you're like, okay.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that was two. Was there a third?
So the third one was I took LSD and it brought me to heaven, right? So it let me see the quote unquote heaven, whatever you want to call it. Now, again, I always tell people this: don't do it. As much as it helped me, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody because here's the difference. You don't know how it's going to impact you after the fact, right? You can have serious PTSD. You can actually lose your mind. So it's stuff you really don't want to go. It's sacred territory. You don't want to just saunter in there like you're on vacation in North Korea, right?
Yeah.
you will get captured by
You're going to encounter demons.
Yes, and they're going to be you.
Yeah.
and so when I took the trip that took me into heaven, what ended up happening there was I started to see that if I just stopped doing the stupid shit, right, and I just started to do the simple, like just be grateful and everything else will work in its place. Like, you have a plate of food in your hands, it doesn't taste good because you wanted to have takeout. Recognize how much work was taken to buy this food when your parents had to walk to the grocery store in freezing weather in Canada to bring this food into you so that you can not go to bed hungry, right? If you start from that point of view and you say, okay, for me to be alive, how many things had to go right? I could have been, and I tell people this all the time, I could have, if I stayed back home, I could have been the leader of the Taliban. That's the kind of mental mindset I have, which is I could have sold these people the idea that, hey, listen, direct me as leader. I know I'll be an arms dealer. We'll do all this. And back then I was completely confused, right? I have this ability that I can sit down in a room and talk to people and sort of convince them of pretty much anything I want to convince them of. And that would have been my way out. Because what else am I going to do in Afghanistan? There's nothing else to do. The highest a pinnacle of achievement there, if I had been born in that and stayed in that situation, would be like, well, might as well join these guys. And once I'm there, might as well get up to the rank and file. And I'm that type of guy. I'm like, you know what? I want to be the leader. I don't want to be just the guy.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm grateful for my parents that they took me out of that situation, that I was able to be exposed to the works of Nietzsche and Dawkins and Hitchens and Jordan Peterson and Nassif Taleb and Steve Jobs and all these other people and reading poetry and that would have never been an opportunity had I stayed there. And so that gratitude is where you start. That's your superpower now. So you're like, okay, with gratitude, I get to stay closer to reality, which gives me a shorter feedback loop into my mistakes, which means I can iterate faster than the guy next to me, which means I can get there a lot quicker to build my city of God, right? That 6-day week work, what we're talking about. Right. So all these things sort of tie together. But also more importantly is if your feedback loop to reality is a lot closer. And I'm not saying I have the perfect feedback to reality. I'm sure it's massively distorted relative to what it actually is. But I could detect patterns. And the most obvious pattern being, hey, lockdowns, BLM riot, it's all good. No, sorry, that doesn't work for me, right? So those type of things start from gratitude.
Yeah.
You come from a country where you can't go anywhere to a country where they tell you your greatest power is that you're a sovereign individual, but now we need you to stay home.
Yeah, I feel like you and I are kindred souls in many ways, and one of the things that your what you just said reminds me of, like, I'm reasonably sure that life is going to be more difficult at sometime in my lifetime for many people than it was when I was growing up in the 90s, right?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
I don't, like, you're the Nathan John Higgins in his Great Simplification really talks about that kind of sort of peak easy energy sort of thing, and that we won't for an expanding population, we won't have as much to go around, so on and so forth, and things become harder. And the only thing that gives me solace about this is what you were just talking about. The ability to understand the patterns that you see, the humility to accept that, like, none of this is given, and the confidence to work through it is what that brings to mind.
Oh, absolutely. So I apologize. Earlier when you mentioned Nate, I was thinking of a different Nate because
I didn't say Nate. I said I use his middle name, just John Higgins. So I think
that's right. Yes, because I don't know his middle name. I just knew Nate. Nate's fantastic. That guy's crazy good. No, you're absolutely right, and we're starting to see. It's ironic. His podcast came out, and he's just been talking about the idea of energy abundance not being an easy thing for us to rely on, and the idea that it's like we've been on this boat and the wind has been blowing in our direction and we think we're great sailors, right?
Exactly.
We're about to see what happens when the winds change. And ironically enough, we're seeing that right now with the energy crunch across the world with Russia and Ukraine and all that stuff that's happening there, and in Canada, the US, and all the inflation that's and again, here's an idea, right? So what I thought about it, and I said, okay, why is the United States so heavily interested in dismantling Russia? All right.
Yeah.
That whole idea. Now, again, there's no bigger fan of the United States that you'll find than me. But when I criticize it from a position of gratitude, because all the great things that have come to the world. I mean, and anybody who disagrees, I always tell them, like, you would have been in a Nazi death camp, just for facts.
Yeah.
That's where you would have been had they not been around. Okay.
And it's for wanting the best for the country and the peoples that have given so much.
100,000%. Right. So I looked at it and I said, okay, here's what's happened. And again, this could be quote unquote labeled a conspiracy, but sometimes ideas that seem preposterous tend to make sense.
Oh, the truth is always stranger than fiction.
Right. So let's do the math. So you decided that we're going to lock down the country for 2 years.
Yeah.
All right. That means that your economy, which is predicated upon growth, is now stalling mid-flight.
For sure.
One of the greatest boons that could happen to the West is if you can somehow convince the Russian people to get rid of Vladimir Putin and put somebody like a Justin Trudeau in charge of that country, right? Because the resources that are available there all of a sudden become part of this sphere of the world, right? So I look at it from the point of view of, I'm like, what if this is just all a play to make up for the fact that they really miscalculated with the lockdowns, because they brought the economy to a grinding halt. And now, I'm not saying that's what they're doing. I'm saying from an economic point of view, what would reinvigorate growth into the West would be if they can immediately get an ally in Russia with the natural resources they have and become integrated into the system as a counterbalance to to China.
I mean, I'm sure that they want the resources integrated with the system. I mean, it is without a doubt a system that is predicated on infinite growth. And Russia and China are, the major stalwarts of that, from their lack of integration, control, and oversight within the banking systems and their, trade distribution.
Well, let's go back to the idea of abstraction, right? So there's a difference between the guy who becomes a king and the son who inherits the throne.
Yes.
Right. So the king has to deal with reality. The son deals with an abstraction of reality. You're born with a silver spoon up your mouth, right? Well,
yes.
In your mouth, up somewhere else, but nonetheless. So let's compound that multiplication factor and let's see what happens. So you're the president of the United States. You're George Washington. Great. Yeah. You are actually an accomplished figure. Jefferson, again, Barbary States, buying Louisiana. Fantastic.
First few decades of the United States history. Amazing men.
Amazing. Absolutely incredible. Fast forward to Joe Biden. Now we have a different conversation, right? So, so the abstraction layers compounding to the point where you're, and again, this also speaks to the media, right? And this is why the media is the way it is, in my point of view. Again, take it with a massive grain of salt. Actually, take it with a bucket of salt. With great gratitude, I posit this theory. If you're a rich liberal white kid who went to these Ivy League schools, your reality is completely abstracted from actual reality.
Yeah.
So what you think should happen based on how smart you think you are is how you start to dictate to the world. And for a temporary moment in time, it will work that way that you think it should, right?
Yeah.
Until reality says, oh, actually, it's time for a phase change. You're no longer in the seat to call these shots. So when we went from a unipolar world of the United States having the bomb, which, and here's an interesting thing about Churchill and my appreciation for him. He had said, hey, you know what? The war is over, but that Stalin guy, I don't know about that guy, right? Maybe we should cap him at his knees before he turns into something.
Yeah, why don't we keep going?
Right.
Yeah,
and
yeah. He saw. I mean, he saw the red threat, no doubt.
100%, right? And unfortunately, the Americans at the time didn't have the stomach for it. So okay.
Well,
so
there was also a lot of sympathizers for the communists in the United States.
You know what? And I'll tell you where that comes from, because a lot of Afghans who are traditionally Muslim, you would think they would know better, but here's where it comes from, right? So the idea of communism is inherently built into your psyche, and the idea is that you want everybody to do well. The blind side of it is sometimes at the cost of your own family, right? It's a utopia for the world, but the country you're in is basically starving. But that's okay. We're going to make the world a better place. Well, how about you start at home?
Well, this is why utilitarianism is a devil in my mind. It's because it gives you this promise of moral superiority and making everything okay, with ignoring the fact that there's just always going to be conflicts between groups.
It has to be conflicts in groups. It's built
into our
nature. Be. Yeah. And you know why? Evolution and variation.
Yes, exactly. I mean,
variation will require that.
We're living through a time of abundance. I mean, where you see the hockey stick population thing go up, right? Like we just there's no way that a creature, an animal like the humans, all of a sudden have a population boom, and it's not because the environment all of a sudden got a ton better for the animals. Well, the thing about all of a sudden an easier environment for those animals is that you get, I think, and this is true both genetically and I could say memetically, is that you get a larger variation of things that otherwise wouldn't survive if the environment didn't get better. So 100%. Right, like, and so these ideas, and I think this is mostly true in the space of ideas, where these terrible ideas that would have never survived the pressures of the old world are now allowed to flourish, and the benefits that they can strew to the human animal in easier times are taken as though that they need to get that to more people.
Yeah, no, 100,000% on that front. And I look at it this way, right? So if you look at what the internet has become, the internet is what we would call the manifestation of infinite variance, right? And there was a funny comedian named Sebastian Maniscalco. He has this piece on Netflix where he says, "Aren't you embarrassed?" Right? So he says, 10 years ago, that guy would have been in his mother's basement dressed up like a diaper baby, right? Now they can get together at a Hilton on a Saturday, and there's like 20,000 of them, right? So now,
oh my god,
it becomes an amplifying source.
Yes,
right?
That's an amazing way to put it.
Now, let's think about that from a different point of view. So let's take a look at it and say, okay, let's talk about genetic variation. So you live in a tribe with your wife. I live in a tribe with my wife. We're separated far enough that we have a small circle that we can interact with. You have your children, I have mine.
Yeah.
Now it becomes a game theory model. The way it becomes a game theory model is I found some fresh water. You come to me and you say, Ace, kind of running low on water. My baby's kind of sick. Do you have anything? Now, for me to survive, I have to lie to you, right? Because if I tell you the truth, what you may end up doing is you may end up killing me at night and taking the water, and now you and your family survived. Maybe you and your oldest son did that. You didn't tell anybody else because you don't want to give them PTSD. You want to keep them morally pure. They don't know where that came from. Right?
Yes.
But you took it upon yourself for your lineage to engage in murder and kill me and my tribe off so you can have access to the water. Right?
Yep. Sorry, buddy.
This is the way the world works.
Yeah,
Now,
exactly.
take that same concept and just start to add the variance to it and just keep multiplying it out generation after generation.
Yes.
7 billion of us, all of a sudden, that's a different animal than a billion of us or 100 million of us
Right.
or 10 million of us, right? So that infinite variance is going to naturally breed conflict simply because the variance is built into it. This is, and if that variance wasn't built into it, there would be no more businesses because the entrepreneurship couldn't exist without variance, right?
Yes.
You need to be able to see things differently. I need to see things from a point of view of like, that's not how it actually works. Let me show you how it actually can work.
Yeah. Okay. Let me take this is awesome, Ace. So on my second podcast, I had a guy named Jason Bradley, and Jason does research into UN and other like NGO policies, where he's been looking at like eugenics and population control and policies that are implemented at the international stage that are pushed into nations, and so on and so forth. And you know, these things have occurred, you know, just kind of like, hey, we've got so many people, how can we control these variables? But the thing that I realized in my own thinking was like, okay, if I wanted to wage war on my enemies, I would get them thinking this way. I mean, do you think that there are people out there who are trying to do this stuff on purpose from a, like, does that resonate with you at all? Like, or is it just this emergent phenomenon?
Well, the answer is yes, because I mean that is both. Okay. And I'll give you an example of where that can happen. Again, thought experiment time. You're born into a family of, you know,
the Rockefellers.
Exactly. Right? You're a multi-generation billionaire, right? One of you is an infinite deviant case of variance. Your idea is that you're the savior of planet Earth. But you need to crack some eggs to make an omelet, right?
Yeah.
You didn't learn the brutal lesson that if you crack eggs and you didn't make the omelet, all you have is a messy kitchen. So what is it that you can engage in? Now, I'll give you an example of where this kind of conversation starts to lead down the path. Now, I'm going to tell you something that, again, people are going to misconstrue this, but that's okay. This is the way the world is. Think about the idea of a flag, right? Okay. You're American. So for you, that flag means something, right? For us, flags have a very specific meaning to them. If you walk across the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan, or from India to Pakistan, a flag is the difference between life or death. Or if you want to talk about the demilitarized zone in South Korea and North Korea. If you're in northern China and you happen to cross over to the North Korean part of the world, you're under that flag's jurisdiction.
Yep.
Right? So why does that matter? Well, let's think about it. What a flag really does is it says, okay, this is a part of the land that has these values. Bannermen in the history of warfare, when they plant the flag, what they're really telling is they're signaling back home that, hey, this area now is under our control.
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you a simple question. Most people don't put that much thought into flags, but let me ask you a question. Where does this trend flag come from? How come it's everywhere?
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure.
You get what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Very much so. I mean, this was an observation that I've seen made on Twitter and like definitely resonated with me.
Right. So it's an encapsulation of a certain set of beliefs. I'm not saying I agree with them or disagree with them. I'm just saying what that flag represents, and it's being flown in corporations and you know, countries all over the world. And it brings with it, it smuggles in through the back door a set of accepted beliefs that are not to be questioned.
Yes.
And it's everywhere. So now you start to think to yourself, okay, if you are a person who was motivated enough to do something of that sort, like you said earlier, maybe coordinating this type of effort could work in that direction, right? It seems to be tearing at the fabric of wherever it lands. There is merit to every idea, even a bad idea, in a more muted puppy level tone of it can be valid, right? So if you look at the idea of fasting, yeah, it's valid. If you do it with the extreme version of the Islamic version of it, it starts to lose some of its credibility.
Right.
The idea that people who are, and again, and I'll give you a story of just so that people misunderstand this. My mother was having open heart surgery in Canada at St. Mike's Hospital. If you're ever in that area, you start to notice something really interesting, which is there's lots of drugs, right? Yeah. Lots of drug use. And there's lots of mental health hospitals in that area. And there's this corner of it, which the Islamic community tends to have taken over. And there's a bunch of Muslim youth standing around the corner. And they're kind of like roaming gangs in that area, so to speak. Okay. Why am I telling you this? Well, I was driving home and there was this trans person trying to get access to a building. And these Muslim youth were actually harassing they were trying to instigate a physical confrontation so they can have an excuse to beat this person down. I took it upon myself to open the window and yell at them so that they can come after me, so the person can have a chance to escape. They did. I had to calculate all this. I'm like, okay, green light, okay, I can go. Not much traffic. I'm not going to get, if they start chasing me, gives this person an opportunity to escape. Because again, I don't want violence upon anybody because I know what that's like.
Yeah.
So I took it upon myself to almost put my life at risk just to help this person who was just trying to get into a building and was being harassed to the point where a physical confrontation was inevitable. So I have absolute empathy and compassion for people to be able to experience reality as they see fit and to help them get to that point where they're minimizing pain for themselves.
Right.
Now, contrast that with the idea that I look around and I see this flag and I see the values that it encapsulates, and those values are mutating every single day. They're not set in stone. That's one of the tells. Yeah. If something is off, it's changing every single time. The reason it's changing every single time is because it hasn't hit the right variation yet. And the way you know that is simply this. The start menu on Windows, always at the bottom left corner, made sense. Nobody needed to change it. The driving, the wheel, the brakes, the seat of the driver's seat. Once it was established, it got established. You don't need to change a car every year and, now the steering wheel's in the middle, right? Sit in the middle. No. Once it's correct, it's in the right spot. You don't have to redo it. The kitchen design, once it's correct, every kitchen is almost exactly the same. The dock on the Apple computer, exactly the same. You don't need to change it 50 times. So if something is constantly changing, that means you're not getting it right.
Right.
So when I see the values that are espoused with this ideology, with that flag, and it's constantly changing, I'm like, they haven't hit the right value yet. They haven't resonated with the mass population enough to be given respect to sustain itself, because they keep changing. And they keep making the circle of what's acceptable smaller and smaller and smaller. And as a consequence, they're actually eroding their base of trust that they could possibly engender in others.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. That, I'll take it as slightly, I'm going to go back to the population question. And it's like, I think there's I've no problem, like you said, like, people live your life how you want to, but I've also got at the same time to steel man the historical record and why these things have been rejected over time, and why there aren't, major religions that include, homosexuality, transgenderism as bedrock protected things. And the conclusion that I came to is because they don't have children. And that any society that encourages these particular ways of being that people have natural inclinations to end up eliminating themselves and undercompeting the people who do, that choose to exclude them. And they end up in the cultures that form around these ways of being end up having to take the kids from families who tend not to have those beliefs.
Yeah, no, I mean, like you said, a self-terminating experimental idea can only be experimented on in conditions of relative peace, security, and stability.
Exactly. And that's why you end up seeing, like, it gets talked about quite a bit. People talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Where like at its crest, like, people were experimenting with these sort of things. The Weimar Republic, when there was this hyperinflation based economic boom, people were experimenting with these things. Yeah.
Experiments, like I said, and I bring it back to Google, right? They have that whole moonshot concept going. Moonshots work when you're printing money like Google does.
Right.
But now the time when that's open to you is not infinite.
Yeah.
You will eventually run into realities where, now they're having massive layoffs in the tech sector because that free money, easy money is no longer, the low-hanging fruits have sort of been picked. And the problem is, when you have low-hanging fruit, you have as a leader, you have two responsibilities, right? One, obviously get your team to pick as many fruits as possible.
Get the fruit.
Get the fruit. But if you're a smart leader, you're like, I need somebody to find the next harvest.
Yeah.
I need you to go and I need you to explore an opportunity in a direction where once this thing runs out, we need to have something to eat. Right. Also, it's going to turn, zero-sum game, cannibalism real quick. And we don't want that. Right.
So, this is why you don't eat the cows in India, right? Like,
there's layers to that, right? There's always these concepts that are built into it. And I always tell people, like, and I'll give another example. Let's revert back to the precautionary principle, right? Oh, it's such a great idea. Okay, try it in a country with 1 billion people. Good luck.
Right. Good luck.
You know what I'm saying? It's not going to work. There's 1 billion people. A lot of them are not financially in a position that you can afford to have them sit at home, because you're not going to have. They don't have Uber. They don't have Uber Eats. They don't have that financial capacity to quote unquote live as the Western indulgent, self-righteous person who advocates for this perspective from on Twitter from their iPhone. Sorry, that's not the real world, right? So,
Right.
so ideas that seem good, I've always said you got to bound them in time and space. What space are you talking about? If you're going to talk about these ideas about, we need more rights for this, or we need more diversity, and I always said to them, okay, why isn't anybody talking about the lack of diversity with Xi Jinping's new cabinet in the Politburo in China? There are no women in that. Forget.
Yeah.
Forget. There's no other Chinese people. It's just there's no women. It's just men. There's 6 men, and they're running the
Right.
operation. You would think the people who are very gung ho on the whole diversity notion would be all over that, but there's silence. You know why there's silence? Because those movements are backed by violence,
Right.
and these movements are protected by violence. That's why I love somebody like Jocko Willink, right?
Yes.
When you see that guy, you're like, you know what? I am. The reason I get to do what I do is because of guys like that exist.
Exactly. It's the A Few Good Men was an amazing movie when I was growing up, and then I realized Tom Cruise was the bad guy.
Yeah,
that the guys sitting on the wall, those are the good guys.
Yeah, like they are. It's not. See, the world can't be reduced to your notion of good and bad in the sense that what we think of it. The world is a complicated, ugly place. When you say somebody's a good person, if you're an adult with nuanced perspective, you mean they're 51% good and 49% bad.
Or they're a benefit to me.
Right. Which is good for you to again.
I mean, I have no universals. Good and bad has a point of view.
Right. Like I said to you, if you're in, we go back to our tribe conversation, I tell you where the water is, and you take it upon yourself to take me and my tribe out. You survive, you pass on your lineage to the next generation. That's good for you. Your great grandkids will never know that's what you did. My great grandkids will never have an opportunity to be born because of the mistake I made. Right. So this is where the whole idea of lying has to come into play, which is why it turns into a game theoretical model, which is where most of the multipolar traps around global politics has been set up with when they were talking to what's that guy's name? Oh my god, I can't believe I'm forgetting the smartest scientist. The name will come to me, but they're on his deathbed. They talked about him, and he came up with the idea of mutually assured destruction. I can't believe I'm you know who I'm talking about. No. Different physicist. The name will come. When it comes, I'll be very much more 10 shades of red embarrassed than I am right now.
Okay. Hawkins?
But no.
Okay. Anyway.
Yeah, we'll get to it. But the point is, what he was talking about was that you model this out from game theory, and all of a sudden you can start creating predictions. Based on those predictions, if the other person doesn't have the information that you do, you can actually exploit that territory.
Yeah.
But we're at that point now where everybody knows everything. And what I mean by that is this. Have you ever gotten into an argument with a person with a heavy accent in real life? Like, let's say an Indian or a Chinese person or a Vietnamese person?
I don't think so.
I have, and I do for fun, right? Because that's just the kind of prick I am. But nonetheless, and I do it jovially, just to get inside the person's head to figure out what they're about. But here's what's interesting: you never can tell somebody who has an accent when they're trolling you on Twitter.
Right.
Because on Twitter, everybody speaks English the same way we speak English.
Pretty close,
right? So if they're gonna troll, if they're embedded in the 21st century cultural phenomenon of everything that the West enjoys, and they're trolling you, you will never know where they're actually from. Now, why is that important? The reason that's important is that the information asymmetry is starting to fall apart, right? So now, here's what I mean by that. You have the United Nations, which you spoke about before. The United Nations is very much reviled everywhere else in the world. You know why? They're not part of it. They were not included in the major decision-making process.
Yeah.
India doesn't sit on the Security Council. They should, but they don't, right? Half the world doesn't speak the languages that the people at the UN pass the resolutions and speak in. So a lot of the part of it of exclusion and not being able to participate exists. So there's resentment and hostility built into the system. When that variance propagates across time, that hostility will show up in different ways. And one of the ways it shows up in is when you tell everybody, hey, we're going to sanction Russia. India's like, no, we're not. You guys do that. We have 1 billion people to feed. Good luck. Now, rewind the clock 50 years ago, and if the same conversation was had, India would have no choice but to agree, right? So the compliance factor, again, this idea of iteration across time comes back into play. The American way of doing business for the past since World War II has come to an end, unfortunately. And the
Yeah.
reason it's come to an end is the asymmetry of information is no longer there.
Right.
Everybody sees through the bullshit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I
And
mean,
once,
it's and it was, I would say, like 10-15 years ago, like the internet really blew things up for that internet. Like, no, everybody knows the hustle now.
yeah, and now, like I said, one of the interesting aspects of it is that what we saw was the internet reveal the sham that has been the medical establishment. And
Oh
again,
yeah.
we fear drastically for what the real next version of this is going to look like, because the amount of trust that was eroded, it's insane, right? We can't trust these people anymore, and they did it to themselves. They took power, and they let it go to their heads, and they start to push a point of view from an authority. There's an old school concept that I have at my team. We walk into the room and we always say, okay, we're solving a problem today. Hands up, everybody who doesn't feel stupid today. And if your hand doesn't go up, you say you don't need to be here. Leave the room. Right. Next thing we always talk about is we say, own your knowledge. Don't flash your badge. Right. I don't care what your badge says. Oh, I went to MIT. I don't care. Show me the code. Show me that it compiles. Show me that it runs to do what it is you're asking me to do. Then I will listen to you. Right. So we went from that generation of people who had to own their knowledge to the generation of people who flashed their badge. Oh, I read this study. I'm like, okay, I don't care about your study, because here's what I'm interested in: reality. Can you take what you said, apply it to reality, and show me the result that way? Because a peer-reviewed paper is game theoretically gameable, right? Bunch of people getting paid. They'll say what they want to be. They'll say what needs to be said because they're getting free money.
And I will tell you, like, the COVID thing blew that up terribly. Like, there's an entire movement now called DeSci, which is attempting to replace, so to speak, the centralized authorities that are like within science, the science journal, like Science, Nature, so on and so forth, and trying to figure out how to take these power structures and route around them. And my wife is heavily involved in that stuff. She's sort of like one of the poster children for that whole movement and trying to think through these problems.
Yeah, I saw she's into the Web3 space, and she's interested in that whole sphere. And what that whole thing is telling you is that the structure of how information is being processed globally is broken. And we saw that multiple ways. We saw it when the banking crisis hit, right? That around that time, a lot of people were quote unquote coming of age, should be buying a home, all setting up a family, all that, and all of a sudden they just saw, well, we just got out of the Iraq War, and now we're seeing the financial collapse. Okay.
Yep.
Oh, and now we're seeing a pandemic, and now we're seeing an energy crisis. Like, there's no break to be caught for a specific generation of people, because for the vast majority of by the way, I just realized the name of the gentleman, John von Neumann. My apologies for everybody who was listening.
I don't know that name, huh?
You don't know John von Neumann?
I do not.
You will be very interested in von Neumann. Brilliant mathematician, physicist guy. The computer architecture is literally called the von Neumann architecture because he was able to solve how computation should be done. He could do math in his head faster than pretty much anybody, and the stories about him are many, but his insights into humanity were fruitful, and that's where he was one of the guys who came up with the idea of mutually assured destruction.
Oh,
right? So if you tell the Russians, if you tell the Russians, listen, you launch a nuke at us, we launch a nuke at you, we all die, nobody wants to do that, right?
Yeah.
Now, that model sounds interesting until you come across the Taliban. Taliban are suicidal, and they think they're going to go to paradise. You think that argument works with them?
Yeah, no.
Right? That's why you don't want them to get nukes, right? So these arguments vary, and again, it always goes back to the idea, asymmetry of information. There's people now who have access to information where previously they would have been just told what to do and they would have done it. Now they're like, that's actually nonsense. It's actually bull. You guys at Harvard who are discriminating against Chinese people, and you're constantly talking about diversity this and inclusion that. Where's all the diversity there, right? So this massive variance of what the internet is just getting started. There's a lot of people who still haven't come online yet, and when they come online, and you have this whole new layer built on top of the structures that were around. I think one of the reasons why these structures, like the academia, banking systems, government, the reason they're constantly face planting live in public is now all their incompetencies are constantly highlighted. Whereas
Right.
before it used to be just, yeah, if you know people in academia in the early 80s and 90s, you would have to talk to an academic to know how bad academia was.
Yeah.
Now I think I saw a history professor literally talking about how lockdowns never happened. I'm like, what? Yeah,
What?
yeah. He had to turn his tweets private, protected, because people were like, what are you talking about? Like, he got ratioed so hard with example after example of like newscasts telling people lockdown this and mask that and cities this, and he's like, oh, I have kids coming into class and they're already buying into this false ideology of lockdowns, which never happened. And
Well,
I'm
this
like,
is like the mostly
holy,
peaceful protest thing. Like, it's
yeah,
like, are
exactly.
you guys kidding me? Like, I went out on the streets of Seattle. I'm watching this. Like, there's fires.
I just remember Michael Malice, the brilliant satirist, who said, "Yeah, 9/11
Oh,
was mostly peaceful flights, right? Except for the few that went into
exactly.
buildings."
Oh, I love Michael. He is he's a national treasure with them.
And you know what's funny about him? Again, another guy who escaped communist
Exactly.
right?
I have never met a person who came from like an Eastern Bloc European country that is like, yeah, the communism, great idea.
Let's do more of that, right?
They're like, they see the patterns, they get it, you know?
Yeah, and you know what's also interesting? In my experience, I've noticed that some of the smartest people who detect bullshit better than anybody else are Polish people. I don't know what it is, but because they recognize that Nazism sucks and they recognize communism sucks, they saw both of those right in front of their eyes, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about pattern detection and bullshit meters that are really properly tuned to reality, talk to some Polish people. Like I've yet to run into, and in Canada, there's like a large Polish community. I went to school with a bunch of Polish people. You know, I get invited. It's insane how consistent those people's points of view are on certain aspects. They see right through it. They're like, no, I just reject that out of hand. And like, why? This is nonsense. It's like, why do you think it's nonsense? Like, well, if you lived fighting against the Nazis and then you lived fighting against the communists, you would pretty much know how to smell bullshit a mile away. Right?
Yeah.
And one of my friends who one of the lessons he taught me is he said, listen, he's like, I don't know what the truth is. Nobody really does, but I know what bullshit is.
I know what it smells like.
Yeah. The minute you start to tell me what I should do for my own benefit, and you're not living it, you're just preaching it. Because the truth of it is, if something is really good, you just do it. You'd have no reason to compel others to do it for you.
And I'll tell you, that's what you just said is my white pill against the next pandemic, right? The real one. Is that like, we're just gonna know, right? Yeah, sure, there's gonna be some like crazies out there who are like, I'm not doing anything, but like when it starts rolling through, people are gonna get on the right page. I mean, the problem with COVID is that it appeared as though it could have been, and you needed to be careful, but then like everybody kept thinking it was Godzilla when it was a salamander.
You know what's funny about that? Let's rewind the clock, because I did this to myself. How did I fall into that trap? You know what happened to me? And this is maybe it resonates with others, but I saw those videos of people on the streets of China.
100%. That's what did it to me. 100%. I fell for that.
Yeah. I saw that and I was like, and at the time I didn't even think. I'm like, wait a minute, what am I doing? Why
they were ridiculous too. They didn't even look realistic. And I'm still going, wait a minute. Exactly. I fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah. And so what that tells us, and again, it tells us that there's a part of our brain that's tuned to these things.
Yeah.
And if you are aware of how these things are tuned, you can actually take advantage of it. When it comes to recognizing these flaws in it's actually built into the scaffolding of our mind, right?
For sure.
And one of the ways we know that is that based on how we evolved as a species, we are attuned to negative information.
Yep.
The reason being is that this is why when we read a negative comment on a YouTube video or one of your Twitter threads, 100 positive threads means nothing. That one negative comment will consume your mind. Why? Well, because in tribal times, if you were meeting a new tribe and everybody was shaking hands and you're exchanging gifts vis-a-vis food and water or whatever, and that one guy gave you a kara, you're like, that guy will kill me at night. I better watch out for him, right? Because he might knife me. So we're mentally attuned to that danger, right? So now if you know that fact going in, and you just say, okay, how do I get the people to believe in something beyond what would be rationally acceptable? And one of the things that really upsets me is that I remember early in the stages of the pandemic, there was a cruise ship that was like a perfect experiment to witness, hey, let's just see how bad this thing really is.
Yeah, exactly.
And that information, again, flew by my head. Now I think back to it, I'm like, okay, that's what I should have clued in. I clued in,
Yeah.
just a little later than I would have liked to. And so we're starting to see, okay, control occurs much more effectively if you can hide information, right?
Mm.
It doesn't work if you give information out. It works if you hide bad information in. And that's what the hall monitor concept is all about, right? That's what, when I asked the teacher, hey, how come malaria is transmitted through mosquitoes? Well, the reason she had me kicked out of the school wasn't because she couldn't answer my question. It's because she couldn't hide me from the other students. You
Yeah.
get what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, this is where
And
that
you
whole
were an
canceling
ongoing
comes in.
risk because you were willing to do that.
Yes, because the way I was raised, in the sense of the way my just to give you an idea of my mother is, she was not allowed to go to school after grade 6. So
Mhm.
she snuck out and she went and she learned the trade of a hairstylist. And she eventually ended up owning her own salon in Afghanistan, which,
Yeah.
but to compound on how all that works, it's like if you're today, if you were to open a market in North Korea and under the regime sell things that are not black market,
Yeah.
like that's the level of accomplishment that is for her to be able to do what she did. And she
Right.
used to tell me all the time, the way it works is you have to take a risk, because if you, it's a fist fight. Either you pick one or they're going to bring one to your door, right? You choose which one you would prefer. Are you
Yeah.
going to go outside and pick the one, or are you going to let them come to the door? And by that time, you're already not ready to go, because the reason she was able to get us out of Afghanistan, and I say it's her, she picked the fight, she got the resources, she took the money, she got the flights, she got the lawyers, she got the guns on our side, right?
Mm.
What you want to do to succeed as your lineage goes forward is you want to make money for two
Yep.
reasons. One, it gives you optionality. Two, it gets you guns and lawyers on your side.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you have to be somebody people don't want to fight.
That's exactly it. You want to be that guy who says, okay, if I go up against him, the cost of doing so is going to be so high that it's not worth my time. So I'm
Yeah.
going to go after the guy who's docile. I'm going to go after the guy whose marriage is a catastrophe, and he just, because he knows he's in a bad spot. His wife doesn't love him. His kids resent him because of his wife. And if he says anything, his wife will divorce him and he'll lose everything he's worked for the past 20 years.
Yep.
That guy's super easy to manage, right?
Yep.
What's even worse is if that guy happens to be slightly smarter than the average bear, because now he can see that that's the outcome of the situation. So he'll quietly agree with whatever the case may be. And an example of that is Sam Harris himself, right? His take on COVID, his ideas of attacking Brett Weinstein, the way he attacked Brett. It's you look at that man and you go, you know what? I always thought better of you, but now that I see the box that you put yourself into has decayed your position and your moral authority so much so that you've become a parody of yourself.
I mean, one of his first books was on lying and about how he never lies. And then he goes and says, I don't care if Hunter Biden has his dead children in his basement.
Exactly. And you know what's funny about that? And I say this to people all the time. I'm like, look, people talk about January 20th. Let's talk about something that's tied into that to give it context. The context being, how do we get to January 20th? When the election January 20th was clearly colluded upon against the man, right? Why would he accept it to be a legitimate win?
So it was so obvious. I don't understand how people I have friends and family. I'm like, look, say what you want about the man Trump. I sure have. He's kind of a scumbag, but
yes,
it's pretty obvious they were rigging the deck against him.
100,000%.
So many ways.
Yes. And what's funny about that is the blowback that's going to come from it. Again, and I always tell people, when you come from where we've come from, we don't trust politicians. I don't care which side they're on. That's just facts, right?
Yeah.
What we do is we say, who's the guy who's most likely to leave me alone? That's the guy I want.
Right.
Because I don't really, I don't want you in my life. I don't want you telling me what to do. I don't want you telling me to lock down while you wear your pride flag socks in Canada, all that stuff. I don't want you going out in the middle of the pandemic.
Hustle you have going on affecting me. And I know you got to hustle.
Exactly. And the problem is, these most politicians are rent seekers. That's just the way they are, right? So they just feed on power and a little bit of wealth here and there, and they've never really created anything. And so you look at that example of how Sam Harris basically betrayed his own principles.
Yeah.
You say you're going to harp on January 20th. Legit. You know what? That shouldn't have happened. He should have expressed his point of view with a disagreement in a much more civilized manner. But to blow it out of the proportion, to make a mountain out of a molehill, you also have to look at the preceding factors that were plugged into that scenario, which is that, hey, we now literally have Zuckerberg come on Joe Rogan and tell him, the FBI told us not to mention this conversation. Like, that's huge. What that
Oh,
tells you is that the
there's been
United States isn't what
there's
it
been a
is.
DHS leak now where
Of course.
they're embedded in all of these tech companies.
Yeah.
It's obviously bigger than anybody was suggesting
Right.
before.
And there's a conversation with Sam Harris and Yuval Harari. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but they were talking about how the future should be decided by Googlers and how democracy is rated and how Google ranks and searches information and all that stuff. And I'm just staring at this
Wow.
going, really? See, this is where that hubris of what Dostoevsky was talking about comes into play, which is that for you to have what it is you have, the previous generations of yours had to deal with the fact that there are people across the street who literally disagree with them on everything,
Yeah.
but they would never take their voice away, right? That's when you go down that road, you're creating an amplifier for your own noise, confusing it for signal.
Are you familiar of the story of like the last two Jews in Afghanistan?
Yes, of course I am.
It's one of my favorite.
like this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? And part of my rejection of Islam is rooted in the fact that it's actually a plagiarization of Christianity and Judaism. So I'm like, you guys aren't even original. Like at the very least, if you had come up with some original ideas and played into that, I would have given you something to it. But what rubs me the wrong way about Islam is simply one fact, and it's this: no matter what anybody says, and no matter how they slice it and dice it and cut it up, I always say to them, the problem with Islam for me is the fact that it claims to be the absolute perfect final solution and answer to all of life's problems. And it can never make that claim for itself.
Does Judaism and Christianity not do that?
No, because what they do is they say this is a way. Islam says this is the last way. Yeah, because so in Islam, Muhammad acknowledges the prophets before himself, including Jesus and Moses and all the rest. In fact, there's like the whole bunch of other prophets that are mentioned, but he says, "I am the last one. I'm the final one." Right? That's where we draw the line. I'm like, oh, okay. Now we have a hubris issue that we have to contend with, right? It embeds within itself an ideological slant that gives ignorant morons a moral high horse from which you can't get them off.
That's interesting because Judaism does have the concept of the prophet coming in the future, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah. And then Christianity does have the concept of, Christ will return or something to that effect.
Right.
Okay.
When you get to Islam, this is it. This is the final stop. This is the final destination. This is the perfect answer to everything that ails you. And there is nothing about life that, marriage, food, sex, politics that is not included in this concept. And I'm like, whoa. You just bit off way more than you could chew. Right.
Yeah.
So to me, where the disconnect comes, and that's why I told you, even if I appreciate and recognize some of the valid points that they bring to the conversation, I cannot wholeheartedly at all remotely accept the perfect answer to an infinitely changing universe. It just doesn't work.
Now, so Islam is obviously very successful in terms of propagating itself and across the world. I mean, but from a Lindy sort of like survivability point of view, does it matter what you think?
It doesn't. It never should. And that's why I always tell people, I'm like, look, I make my bets based on what I see.
Yeah.
You obviously should place your bets on what you see. But here's the thing, right? What is true and what is survivable are two different things, right? Because what can be true now is also false tomorrow, right? Based on the context of what piece of information you're giving me.
I mean,
the vaccines are 100% effective. True. Until they're not.
I guess I use truth in a very pragmatic way where like truth is not objective. It requires a person believing it to exist. So it's like almost like this tree falls in the woods. Is there a sound sort of thing? Well, if there's nobody around, there's no sound. And the same I feel is like for truth.
Well, for me to reconcile that problem in my head, what I always do is I say there are technical truths and there are political truths, right? So a technical truth is the force of gravity. You jump off a building or you throw an apple, it's the same truth for everybody. If I tell you 9/11 was X, that's a political truth that you can get into an endless debate about, right? Yeah. So the problem with religious connotations is it tries to have a foot in each camp, and that's where it starts to fall apart. Because when you're in the hardened atheist side of the conversation, which we both previously were in, we can immediately see the political falsehoods that it presents, right? Okay, this is weak, this is wrong, this is not going to work out, all that other jazz that comes into play. We immediately can reject it, and then we get blind to the technical truths that it also brings into the conversation.
Mm.
Similarly, the people who believe in it wholeheartedly are blinded to the technical truths that it misses, right? And for me, the overall arching conversation is always this, right? So as a systems architect for the computer systems that I build, we always say, like I'll give you an example. So I'll architect a system that I can actually mediate data transfer from video across Canada. We built something of that sort. And the conversation is like, well, how much can that handle? How much load can it handle? What's the peak traffics? Under what conditions is that true? How many requests can that server process per second? Oh, it can handle 786 requests per second. Okay, that's under ideal conditions if all the microservices that code depends on are also operating under ideal conditions. Let's do a test. Let's just run every system chaotically with variances in terms of how many requests. So if you have an API server that actually has to talk to a database and it has to actually talk to a web server, then it has to talk to a phone, all those other systems, let's inject variance into all these systems and let's put it under load. And then we can give you a more granular point of view of like, okay, under condition X, Y, and Z, it can handle this many requests per second. If those conditions are not met, here's how quickly the system can deteriorate. Right now, when you think of it from a systems architecture point of view, your entire process is predicated upon failure. Under what conditions is this not going to be true? And so when it comes to the concept of, we're bringing it back to Islam, under which conditions is this the final word of God, and this is the final prophet, this is the best answer to everything there is in life, under which conditions would those not be true? Right? When it gets to that level, all of a sudden everything unravels. So you start to see the embedded assumptions into the system. And so what I always tell people is, and I have a famous line for this, which is that don't marry your models, because then you can't go on dates with reality, right? So you've created a mental model in your head and you start to marry that, and reality says, okay, we're no longer going out on dates with you.
So what you've really done is set up an almost inevitable failure point in Islam for a system from the point of view of the practitioners. Like, if given a long enough time frame, like, yeah, okay, I think I'm picking up what you're putting down there. It's like, if you don't leave open the ability to question and modify an environment, then you can't deal with all environments that could come along.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Right? So again, and unfortunately, what it does subconsciously in a very subtle way is it actually injects a significant amount of hubris into your mindset.
Right.
Because think about it. This is the perfect answer. It can never be that. Right. Right. It's kind of like programming languages. We go to that. Oh, this language is perfect. It's this. It's that. Okay, great. Now you've locked yourself in. Now you've whatever that prison you create with the word science. Now I couldn't give you a better prison in your mind than to tell you have something that's perfect. There is no better prison I could create for you. Because now that I think, once I get you to believe that, I could totally manipulate you into doing whatever it is I want you to do. Because I just have to look at you and say, okay, this person's emotional expectations. Remember, an idea to embed into you to the point where it actually makes you fight your own family, it has to bypass all your filters, right? It has to hit you emotionally at the core. Yeah. How do I do that? Well, first I have to know where your emotional standpoint is. Once I know that, then I could say I have to feed you information that you think is true, and I could just slightly twist it in such a way that you don't even notice that it happened. Right? That's where the cop coming into a conversation. There's a reason why they ask you questions, because they know that doctors ask you questions and teachers ask you questions and parents ask you questions, because it's embedded into the scaffolding of your mind. Right? So if I tell you from a young age, and so just to give you an idea of how the Islamic tradition works, the first thing a baby is told is the call to prayer. Right? It's called the adhan. And so the baby, when the baby's born, they usually get a mullah or an imam or whatever you want to call it. One of them comes in, and they say the call to prayer in the child's ear, in the right ear. So the first things they hear are the words of God. Great. Okay. Understandable tradition. Makes sense. Spiritually beautiful. Got it. But amplify that. Constantly walk it forward. Okay, what's the next thing that you're told? The next thing you're told that this is the religion you were born into. You're lucky. You're blessed. You will have the perfect answer to every single person's problems.
Well, that's going a little far.
Right. So now let's think about it this way, right? So you think about the Islamic tradition, and you look at when Europe was in decline, and you had the great thinkers and scholars doing work in the University of Baghdad around the Middle East, right? Islam was doing well, and all of a sudden the religious I guess you would call them the imams of that time, or the jurisprudence, the people who are Islamic scholars were saying, hey, you know what, let's focus on the knowledge that validates what's already been said in the Quran versus finding new knowledge. And right then and there is when the fall of Islam as a civilizational force for good started to collapse on itself, because the weight of those assumptions.
Right.
Let's take a look at everything that's out there to be known, to validate it against this book. Now you've created a constraint for yourself that you can't get out from under. So what happened after that, if you look at any part of the world where there's an Islamic culture, is there's no progress.
Right.
And if take away the oil, what do you have? Right? Nothing.
Goat herders? I don't know.
Right. And I mean that and as a person who comes from a shithole country, which is a fact. And the reason it's a shithole country is because the culture that it's imbibed into that place is one where if you step out of line, they will kill you. Right. I had a cousin of mine, literally about 4 years ago, he was murdered by the Taliban. You know why? He was at a wedding. They had rented a Toyota Corolla. Just recognize the fact it's a Toyota Corolla.
Okay.
They were driving home, and there's a Taliban guy standing at some corner in the street, asked to be patrolling as a guard, wearing basically sandals. And he said, why does this guy have a Corolla and he's driving a car and I'm standing here? He shot at him for no reason. Put a bullet in his liver, put a bullet in his lung. The man suffocated to death for 4 hours.
Ugh.
He's 22 years old. Right? Now, if that's not the definition of a shithole country, I don't know what is. Right?
Yeah.
People get offended on my behalf. I'm like, you have no right to get offended on my behalf. I can tell you what it is because I have people there that are constantly in touch with the reality that is imposed upon them.
Yeah.
You have no the worst thing you could do, and I remember this from Hitchens, right? And he said that at least in death you have release. Right, in some parts of the world, where they say, even when you die, you're gonna be sent to hell and you're gonna be tormented.
There are fates worse than death, no doubt.
Right, and so you think about what would be worse than all that. It'd be to live in North Korea. You have what are your prospects? Sure. Are you gonna have a podcast? I don't think so. Right, and if you
the arduous march,
exactly right, and your daily existence is meaningless, and once you take meaning out of a person's life, you take hope out of their conversation. They have nothing left.
Viktor Frankl.
Right? That's exactly it, right? So these conversations, it's funny how themes are basically always spreading up everywhere. That's one of the ways you could tell if something is true, is if it's applicable in one area and it shows up in another area, right? So if the idea of the reason why I love computer science so much is the idea that your entire job as a systems architect is to validate assumptions. That's what I do. Good systems architects, from the people I've learned from, they're always telling you, yeah, that's great. Under what conditions is it true? Right? And the minute you can figure that out, all of a sudden you set yourself up for a position to capitalize on an informational asymmetry. You know that person telling you that that's true is going to be wrong under these new conditions. So you can actually set yourself up to say, okay, you know what? You think you have the perfect answer to everything in life? I know where you're going to fail.
That's funny. It reminds me of my favorite interview technique, where you just ask somebody to explain anything that they're expert in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be to do with the position they're applying for. And you get one thing that you get out of that is you get to see how the person communicates. Another is they get to demonstrate depth of expertise, because you just keep drilling in and asking them to explain in more and more granular detail whatever thing that they're explaining. And they should always come to be able to the conclusion that they can't explain any further.
Right.
And if you find somebody who can always explain further, they're a liar.
Yes. One of the people
not humble enough to. Yeah.
There's a perfect example of this. The Scott Adams guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh God.
Everything.
I feel so bad for Scott.
Yeah, I listen to him and I'm like, every single time something happens, you come back after the fact and you give us an explanation post hoc. And I'm like, okay, that's the sink oil salesmanship right here. And what I mean by that is, I want you to make a prediction ahead of time, and then I want you to admit humility when you're wrong after the fact.
Yeah, none of it
happens, right? Again, I am one of the most flawed people on walking this planet, which is great. It's a relief. If I don't have to be perfect, that means I have room to make mistakes. Perfect. Works out for me. What I always tell people is, I'm like, listen, here's the deal. Right? The deal is, we abhor uncertainty. Some of us can tolerate it better than others. Most of us really can't deal with it. If somebody comes and tells you a specific truth, even if you know it's a lie, but you can feel like, okay, something may be a lie if it's individually accepted, but it may turn into truth if a number of people accept it. That's how, right? So I'll give you an example. Okay, we're in a tribe. Hey, listen, it's a pack of wolves coming this way, man. That's crazy. You're going to be scared to death, right? Knowing that piece of information is going to give you a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty. Even if that's false, the fact that it's there is going to make you have restless nights. Your quality of life is going to deteriorate. You may not be able to succeed in the next hunt. All those things are factors. But what if everybody in the tribe believes that to be true? Now, we go and set up a defense, right? We're ready to take on these wolves. We have an exit strategy that we can all leave should the pack come looking for us. All of a sudden, you could function better as a tribe if everybody believes the same lie.
Yeah.
Now, you say, well, what's the harm in that? Well, there is no harm in that because you're prepped, right? This is Taleb's idea of, oh, Russell in the bushes might be a bear or it might be a stone. It's better to assume it's a bear.
Yeah.
What if you assume it's a bear and you start running in a direction, you fall off a cliff? Was it better for you then?
Right.
You see what I mean by what is true under which conditions?
Yeah.
So the Russell in the leaves, it's a bear, is true.
Well, it might have been
until you fall off a cliff.
So in my model, it was true right up until the point they no longer exist to believe it.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. So once you know it for a fact that it's not really a bear, it was a stone, but you insist on it being a bear. And again, we go back to Nassim's ideas. Some of them are brilliant, where he was talking about the idea of updating your Bayesian priors. And the example he gave, which was brilliant, was that what if you hear what sounds like a gunshot, but it's just a car backfiring, right? Yep. The time will come when that gunshot is a real gunshot and it actually hits you, and now you have no opportunity to update your priors because you got killed.
Yeah.
Right. So there's always, and I think one of the things that Nassim and his ideas really appeals to are people who are smart. But then what it can do is it can trap you, because what it does for you is it says, okay, this is a really smart way of looking at something. But what he doesn't tell you, and what I'm pretty sure most of his followers don't really recognize, is the context under which that's true.
Well, I think if we bring Jocko into this like little model that we're talking about, you get a really nice balance, because he likes to talk about the dichotomies of these situations where you have to essentially have a way of balancing whether the importance of treating whether it's a bear or a stone and being prepared for both situations, and and operating under that uncertainty and having the humility to recognize that.
100%. And the other element of that, which is one of the things I learned from computer science, and I learned this just from working with different programming languages. Each programming language is built under a set of assumptions under constraints. So for example, JavaScript was invented in 10 days by Brendan Eich, who at the time was given a function to add some dynamic elements to the web. Now, a programming language created in 10 days by one guy under pressure is going to have different assumptions built in than a programming language like Go, which was created by Rob Pike, Ken Thompson, and Robert Griesemer, who were constrained by the build times it takes for C++ to compile Google code base. Right? Mm-hmm. Different assumptions, different timelines. Mm-hmm. Why do I tell you all this? Well, what's interesting is when I tell people who are learning how to code and how to do programming, is I said one of the reasons it helps you think is that it gives you different models of reality. And if you overlap all the models, a lot of your own blind sides will get rejected. So if I have multiple models and each model has a flaw, but if I overlap all of them, hopefully one model will compensate for the flaw in the previous model. Right. So if I'm looking at JavaScript as a programming language, which a lot of people use for front-end development, they go, oh, you know what? JavaScript is so cool. Let me put front-end, back-end, all of it JavaScript, so it's a lot easier for me to develop. I said, that's great. But what you just did was you propagated all your faulty assumptions from the front to the back. So now you're going to get blindsided by some attacks that are going to take place from the vectors where we know JavaScript has a lot of vulnerabilities into it.
I think another way of saying that is you have multiple maps of reality that your observations have to conform to, and more of these maps that they're like, this looks about right on this map, the more confidence you can have that you're acting in a way that'll get you from point A to point B as you intend.
Exactly right. But the only caveat I'd add to that is more models, but always bounded in space and time. Under which conditions could this be held true?
Right. When is this model applicable? And you try to, and if you can say like this model seems to work, this model seems to work, like Yeah, we have this amount of confidence with this model, so we'll ease into it here, right? Kind
Exactly.
of thing. Yeah.
Right. So think about it this way, right? So you have Newtonian mechanics, from which you can take a rocket and launch it from here to Mars, no
Right.
problem. Then you have Einstein's equations, that general relativity, all that. Does it negate Newtonian mechanics? No, it just gives you a better picture. But here's what's interesting. The physics from the people I've listened to, when they tell you, is that when you hit a black hole, all those models collapse, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's telling you one more time, what appears to be true in a specific context. So there's a great author, spiritual guy named David R. Hawkins. So he wrote the books. There's about 7 books. One of the most intellectually phenomenal people that I've ever come across. One of his books is called I. So and when he says I, he's talking about I as in you and I as in the ego. And what he always said, one of the great takeaways from him was context defines content. So what is the content that you're looking at? And what is the context in which that is applicable? And the way he illustrates that point, which is what I'll illustrate for you here, is imagine you came home and I said to you, hey man, unfortunately I had to kill your father. And you're like, oh, okay. Under which, now you might say your first reaction might be, well, I have to kill you. Right. Now, what if I said to you, unfortunately, your father was dosed with some really bad fentanyl and he was having a bad trip and he was trying to kill the rest of your family. The only way for me to stop him was to kill him.
Right.
Now, your judgment of what I did is entirely different because of the context that I gave it to you under, right? So whenever people provide you information, one of the first things that I always try to ask is, what's the inversion of the assumptions that are built into this? What did he think was true that led him to this conclusion? Because sometimes, just like that fallacy of the hot hand, what seems to be valid is a conclusion that somebody now uses as a predicate for the next 2 predicates to build a new conclusion upon. So the conclusion looks sound because you're looking at it from A to B to C. That's great. But what if the A predicate was a conclusion built on something faulty before it? And now underlying all that, it turns out to be false.
Yeah.
Get what I'm saying? So how do you get around that?
For sure.
Invert the assumptions. Ask them, why do you think that's true? And well, they'll tell you, oh, I think it's true because X, Y, and Z. And it's okay. Can this be true if we immediately invert everything? Let's just invert everything. What do I mean by that? Okay, let's take a look at the banking infrastructure, right? Too big to fail. How to get too big to fail? Well, let's go with the assumptions. Bankers used to be very conservative types who wouldn't lend money out to people unless they knew that this person could pay them back. Okay.
Yes.
Time came around when, oh, you know what? If we just give out loans to people who are chasing the American dream versus the people who are financially creditably able to follow the American dream, that whole idea of ninja, which is no income, no job, no whatever assets. What if we toss that away and we gave people loans? Okay, now you made an assumption, but that assumption temporarily in the context of that period of time is like a parasite. It can grow. Now, if it's growing, it looks like it's a living organism and it's making you money. And the way we know that is because it's profitable. What do you do with that? Oh, I know. What if I take that and I start selling it to more people? Now you got a contagion spreading across the entire financial economy. But now you got people placing bets, right? So people are placing bets in credit when they're doing options. A regular option is one thing, which is like, I'm going to bet you X is going to go up by this much over this period of time based on what I think is the reality of that company. You're going to bet against it because you think it's going to go down. Let's place a friendly option bet and we could proceed forward. But what happens if a whole generation of bankers comes in and these assumptions are layered on top of each other? Eventually, the house has to collapse, right? Yeah. And you have to ask this question: why did these people have MBAs? They're not stupid. They have PhD statisticians. Why did they make these bets? They made these bets because nobody questions the underlying assumption. Nobody did the inversion of it. Okay, what is the inversion of this? And so when I build systems, one of the things we do is just say, okay, security is baked in from the start. We don't start with security as a bolt-on after the fact. What we do is we say, okay, what operating system are we going to select? Well, we're going to select Linux. Okay, which version of Linux are you going to select? I'm going to select the bare bones minimal amount of Linux that I need that only gives me what I want. And that's what I'm going to start because I'm reducing my surface area of attack right off the bat. Okay, cool. But what is that system going to run on? What kind of chip am I running it on? I'm running it on Intel. Oh, that means it's got zero-day exploits that are built into it because of how it does branch prediction. Okay, so now if you're running a really sophisticated system for a financial processing unit, you have to start there. So, okay, well, we don't want anything with an Intel chip because we know this flaw exists, right? Work around that from there and then start to slowly build up with the smallest assumption and the smallest amount of information that is required to get the task done. And then what you'll have is you have something that you can actually maintain. Contrast that with some of the other systems that I work with and some of the telecoms I do consulting with. Here's what will happen. people don't know this, but telecoms are basically held together by glue, spit, and tape. And it's
Completely
really
unsurprised.
right. And here's why. So
I have a software background, at least with from the product management point of view. So yeah, hearing
right,
that is not a surprise to me whatsoever.
exactly. So I walk into a place and there's like this, there's a server here that does this one thing. What does it do? Well, it activates some cards. Well, it's kind of important. Yeah, it is. Nobody ever touches it. We pray near it. We don't go near it. We don't touch the code. Git
Yeah.
was invented when the code for this thing was around. The company that wrote the software for this thing is no longer in business. We actually now pay a third-party company millions of dollars a year to reverse engineer this code so that we can actually get a version of it running because we can't afford this thing to ever go down. All right. Now you got a path dependency problem. Now, like think about it. People who build software tend to be very smart. Again, it goes back to my original idea. The easiest people to fool are the people who are smart. So now you've built a cage for this person whose business is dependent on this piece of software that they have no control over.
Yep. So I did some consulting for a hospital system, and their entire like claim system was built in with the same critical flaw. So yeah, this is I think endemic, and in especially in industries where like I would imagine that the technology grew up where the security wasn't like the core product. You just had to keep the train running.
Exactly. And fairness to those people, and I never dump on my predecessors whose code bases I end up touching. I always understand they're under a set of pressures. Usually, oh, we need this done as quickly as possible with this little bit of money, get it done. So I have compassion for that particular point of view. The thing that's interesting is I always tell people software should be like your lawn. It's never done. You always have to mow it. You always have to look for weeds. You always have to change stuff around. And things that are built that aren't designed with that assumption built into place are things that are going to rot. And once they rot and they get deep into your system, you're stuck.
Yeah.
And this is why banking systems can't get their financial, so algo programmers are still required. Fortran programmers are still getting jobs. Why? Because they're not willing to invest in the money to update into new systems because they're like, this is what we've always done. Right. Yeah. So that part of legacy code is also it's interesting. Think about legacy code. Think of genetic code that's legacy for us. Think of belief systems, tribal systems that are legacy for us that worked at a specific period of time but are not updatable. Goes back to Muhammad's idea of this is the perfect answer to everything, right? That's legacy code. It can't be updated.
Yes, it is.
Right? So the context, again, is always what's going to be interesting around these particular points of view, which is that you always have to look at this and say, okay, where's this person's assumption of reality and how much of a gap is there that I can exploit as an asymmetry? And the way I can do that is A, I ask the questions, and B, I look at their assumptions. Right. And once I have those two things in place, then I could bound this and I could time this. This person assumes this was true. If you met me in 2008, staunch atheist, the world is much better off with that religion. Why? Under those contexts, bounded under those conditions, a Muslim who escaped communist invaded Afghanistan, came to this part of the world, didn't like the religion he was imposed upon. All that seemed right to me, right? And the best part about humility is you could say, yeah, it sounded like a good idea at the time. Yeah. It truly isn't now, right? Because it's like if I ask you a question, hey, what are the odds of Apple increasing the stock value by 10% over the next year? It's pretty high. But if I take that timeline and I shrink the horizon to the next second, the answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? Any minute, if you're day trading at all, stocks going up and down per second, nobody can predict that. It's literally infinite variance, right? So if you're going to make a bet on a short time horizon, you're going to be wrong most of the time. If you bet it over a longer horizon, that's why they say the arc of history is long and it bends toward justice. You notice how they say it's long. There's a reason they say that, because they know over the short term, it can totally go in the opposite direction.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that concept is one of the reasons that I'm white pilled so much, where I think the good guys win. And it's because the good guys are the ones who deal with reality as it is and end up making good choices. But what, in the short term, though, in the medium term, I mean, there's a huge amount of suffering and pain to get there.
100%. I mean, I'll tell you one of the interesting things about me is I read Satoshi's original paper back in 2009.
I'm so glad you went there, because I was just about to ask you about Bitcoin with everything that you're the first. This show used to be called Proof of Work,
right?
The very first episode, and then I changed it because there was problems with the search and whatnot, and I didn't. It's not Bitcoin centric, but I wanted to ask you, what's your take on Bitcoin?
Yeah. So again, my take on Bitcoin is that it's an interesting piece of technology.
Hmm.
The reason it collapses is the people who found it have found their new Muhammad, right? Satoshi is their
Okay.
new Muhammad, and so they become maximalists, and all of a sudden they get
Mm.
blinded to their own reality, and that's
Mm.
when it starts to become cultish, i.e.,
Oh, it's
in
certainly
charitable scale,
cultish.
right? So the minute you smell cult, you gotta be careful. It's like, okay, now there's assumptions built into this that I can't validate. And I was working with a startup back in 2012, and their entire idea was we want to bring this to the masses and we want to do all this, all the usual stuff that you hear.
Yeah.
And in 2012, I asked the guy, so let me ask you a question. He said, yeah. I said, okay, they were open protocols of the web, which were supposed to make the internet free for everybody.
Yeah.
I said, yeah. I said, do you believe in those protocols, TCP, IP, all that jazz? Yeah, I do. I
Yeah.
said, great. Have you noticed what it actually has done? It's
Right.
accomplished the exact opposite, right? What was supposed to be a free and open internet is controlled by Facebook and Google on the internet.
Yeah.
To a smaller extent, maybe Wikipedia, right? Now, here's what's interesting about that. Facebook is essentially a form where you input data and that's it. Twitter is essentially a list. It's a list item of various
Hmm.
things that's stored in the database. Google is free form search, but it's not really free form because we know the bias from the Google engineers. They're going to be adapting to that system. What's the problem here is open protocols were predicated upon a utopian vision of how the internet is supposed to work. And then the people who are, like I said, what if you have somebody in a position of power whose sole motivation is money? They will tell you, yes, I believe in socialism, utopia, X, Y, and Z, but they'll exploit it to their advantage and they'll actually commandeer the entire system. Meanwhile, fooling all the people in their and under their control that they're doing the right thing.
Hmm.
So, as a consequence, what seemed like a good idea actually flipped it to be the worst idea we've had so far.
Mm.
Same thing with the Bitcoin concepts, right? The idea is that the protocols and all the stuff that these guys were coming up with, solving the double spend problem and all that other wonderful stuff. I said, what's happened is in reality, is a small number of people have become extremely wealthy, and everybody
Hmm.
else has seen no benefit from it.
So far, yeah, for sure. Yep.
Right now, again, over the long arc of history, I wanted to see it get. If it's a living, breathing entity, the fact that it went from $0 to 1 cent is already it's automatically a victory because anybody who's ever started a business knows if you can get something for somebody to pay a penny for it, you've already made a business out of it. The
Yeah.
fact that it starts to grow or shrink, whatever, time will tell. But what has to be always taken into consideration is when these conversations are put into place. I always tell people one thing. I'm like, look, what Steve Jobs did with the iPhone is what Bitcoin hasn't been able to do yet. And here's what I mean by that.
Hmm.
He took a piece of glass and he put the internet protocol on it so that anybody on earth could interact with it. He empowered everybody around them. And I remember this conversation from Alan Kay. And Alan Kay's point of view, Alan Kay is probably one of the most brilliant people. He's still alive, one of the early Apple engineers. You could watch his talks on YouTube. Super, super smart guy. But one of his famous quotes that I love is he says, perspective is worth 80 IQ points, right?
Hmm.
And the way we explain that is I say, okay, imagine you lived 2,000 years ago and you wanted directions from Egypt to Rome. You'd have to gather the smartest mathematicians who knew geometry and whatnot and get the cartographers and whatnot to sort of draw you maps that you can actually make it from Egypt to Rome and probably not die on the way there, right?
Hmm.
Now you give a potentially really dumb person an iPhone or an Android phone and you say, open the Maps app and just type in where you want to go. And all of a sudden you've empowered that person.
Yep.
You get what I'm saying? So to me, the way I judge a person's capabilities of knowing if they put product first or if they put profits first is this: are they empowering themselves or are they empowering everybody else around them?
Hmm.
And so with a good product, you're giving leverage to people who don't have any. With a good con artist, what he'll do is he'll make himself rich at the expense of others, meanwhile telling everybody else that this is good for them as well.
Hmm.
And so I've watched the Bitcoin process. I've watched all the NFT nonsense that went on for a while.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, you know what? It's being sold, and the people who are making money are doing it at the expense of others who are losing their livelihoods at it. And that's
Mm.
where we have some problems. There's an asymmetry of information. People don't understand how this stuff really works, so they're being exploited for it. But it doesn't say that this is bad or it's terrible or it's evil. It's just saying that the current iteration of it hasn't reached the potential that it's promising to
Yeah.
be.
I mean, I was assuming that Bitcoin would be a lot further along than it is in terms of the global monetary system, just simply based on what we're seeing with all the inflation.
Inflation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
It turns out it's not a hedge for inflation at all.
It was the funny thing about it right now is it seems to be, it seems to be behaving better than the stock market in terms of stability all of a sudden. There's a few interesting things, but it's certainly nowhere close to what I thought it would be, with the pressures going on around it right now. um yeah, it's like the US dollar is, and I it didn't really dawn on me until recently why this is happening, and is eating everybody's lunch.
Yeah, well, because again, I always tell to people, I'm like, listen, here's what's interesting about it. What's interesting about it is this: we're all on the global highway for e-commerce, and commerce and e-commerce are now basically essentially the same thing, because when you
Yeah.
tap your debit card, it's e-commerce nonetheless. What's interesting is to get off the ramp, no matter what your currency is, you have to come back to dollars, because people in the regular world don't
Yes.
don't don't trade in Bitcoin and whatnot, right?
80% of all international transactions are made in dollars.
Right. And until you come around that problem, everything else is a pie in the sky type of yay in the future utopia X, Y, and Z. I'm like, look, I'm not bashing you. I want you to go and do it.
Yeah.
I just want you to be humble in how you prognosticate about its prospects, because in the process you're robbing a lot of people of their money. Because people, yes, there's a sucker born every minute, and yes, if you're going to sell your house and buy Bitcoin because you think you're going to become a Bitcoin millionaire and you go bust, do I really have sympathy and empathy for you? Not as much as you would think, but also not as little as you would think, because I would look at it that way and to say, look, you sat in a room with a guy who on YouTube spoke all these fancy economic terms and told you all about
Yeah.
this monetary policy and all this code stuff, and it sounds good, and you bought into it. How's that any different than somebody who bought into, yeah, you should get the Moderna or the Pfizer and get yourself double vax because I have a PhD from school Y and this is what we think is true. It's the same. The problem isn't the fact that this happened. The problem is that there's the asymmetry of information was exploited. As soon as it becomes exploitative, it turns into con man situations.
So it sounds like you're a believer in Bitcoin to an extent, but you do not have, you're humble enough to say that you have no idea about the time horizons and promises can't be made. Is that
right? This
okay?
is
So you and I are on the same page now. I had way more confidence on the time horizons about a year ago. And then
yes.
I'm like, my models blew up. So now I've got to be humble again. And
This is it, right? like we said before, if you marry your model, you can't go on dates with reality, right?
yeah.
And
And I really thought I forget it, the plan B model looked really good too, man. I'm like, oh, this, and like, then that failed. And I'm like, and he just started pivoting his story. And I'm like, oh shit, I was conned. Didn't really
you know
work.
what? This is the funny part of it, right? So another thing that I've been quote unquote famous for or known for is that I have basically three sentences to my name. The back to Whitman's quote, all of life is but a play, you may contribute a verse. My three verses so far have been, if you whisper the truth, you can actually listen to it echo across the universe, because the truth doesn't need to be yelled at. It just needs to be just told. Like, just quietly say it. That's what it is. The second one was, again, like I said, if you marry your model, you can go on dates with reality. But the third one is a much more profound one. In my point of view, is that time burns all assumptions, right? We make an assumption in our model, and time shows you how wrong you were.
Yeah.
Right. So here's what I say to people. I'm like, this goes back to Chesterton's fence. People's assumption of how bad the dollar is and how mismanaged the U.S. economy is because of the bad politicians and the corruption of the FDA and the corruption of the FBI and the deep state and all that jazz. Yes, okay. I'm not saying that none of that is true. What I'm saying to you is that you're walking up to a fence and you're basically taking it apart. You're trying to put a new fence up, and you don't recognize what that fence was actually doing. You don't know how much the US dollar was embedded into the global economy until you tried to remove it.
Yeah.
Right. It's like how some people don't like anchovies on their pizza. Well, the US dollar is like sort of like anchovy that was crushed into the dough of the pizza that was made. Right. So you're going to have this problem of you're going to try to extract the corruption element of it because you want to say math is incorruptible. Math is not incorruptible. Math, as Kurt Gödel has told us, is undecidable. Right? There's an undecidability problem built into these assumptions. So the smarter the person is, the more likely they are to fall for this trap. And so when I say to the people who are, and again, I read the paper in 2009 when buying Bitcoin was a whole venture to get it done, and along the way I kept seeing something interesting. I'm like, Steve unveiled the iPhone. Within a year, the entire planet had access to something that they never had access to before. They had the entirety of human knowledge in their pocket on a glass screen. This protocol has been introduced, has been hyped. The smartest people supposedly are working on it. And we have yet to see the average person see any benefit from this. So the leverage is not symmetrically distributed across the world. It's asymmetrically in the pockets of people who are already rich getting richer from it. So to me, that's the smell. That's a code smell. Right? I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm not saying they're evil. I'm saying the amount of hype they put into it doesn't match the reality of what they've been able to deliver from it. Ironically, if you watch Steve present the iPhone, he said the smartphone market is X, and we hope within a 2 to 3 year horizon that we can get 1% of that market share. Very subtle, conservative estimates, not overhyping it. Now, of course, they have their marketing machine that's going to push it to its limits, but in the process, they weren't saying this is the cure for cancer, right?
Right.
The people who are, that there's a reason that meme of Bitcoin fixes your broken marriage, right? there's a reason that came about, is because it's saying the absurdity of the claim. It's almost Mohammedan at the level of it. This is the perfect answer to all that ails the world. The world is far more complex than you could possibly imagine. It's the interactions between it. And like I said, there's everything has a probability of one. There's some things that have a probability of happening once in a million, right? That's a 1 in a million chance. But because there's so many things happening, those 1 in a million things happen all the time, and they interact with each other. Who would have seen what we saw? Who would have seen, like, the fact that one of the things that the demise of the West, in my point of view, from an Afghan who's escaped communism, the humble point of view is this: the day the virus wasn't allowed to be called the Wuhan virus is the day the West lost its process, right?
Yeah.
You can't even call the truth what it is anymore.
Yeah.
Because you can't call. And ironically, listen to people in India, listen to people in other countries. They don't call it COVID. They call it the Wuhan virus, right?
Because we always name viruses where they came from. Like Ebola is named after some damn river.
Exactly, right? So the fact that so now you have to stop and think about that. How do you get an entire civilization to turn on its head on a simple truth? If we can't call it what it is, how are you going to fix it?
Yeah.
Right. You've lost the plot already, because you've already done off the bat, before you even walk into the room to have the conversations. You said, I have to accept and eat this live first and foremost.
Oh yeah.
Now let's go ahead and solve this problem.
That Daszak and the Eco Health Alliance are still getting government funds. It's like, are you really?
Yeah. You know what I mean? And here's our problem, right? We've always thought of the government as a competent social entity, because we beat the Nazis. Okay. So I always tell people this. I'm like, okay, imagine Apple on day one in the garage, and imagine Apple today. Those are not the same companies, right? The government that actually coalesced around the threat of Nazi Germany is not the government that you see today. The government you see today, sort of like the corporations that go around, there are busybodies inside of it, more concerned that emails aren't being sent with signatures and pronouns in them than solving actual problems, right? Now, that contagion got so bad that it's gotten to that point. So you say to them, you say, okay, where are your dollars being allocated, and what problems are you actually trying to solve? And the greatest trick, I think, that the fallen communist bloc pulled over the West was that they convinced people that the job of business was to become a social enterprise, and it's not. That's where you get all the social justice nonsense built into these companies. That's where the whole idea, woke capital, ironically, is blind to its own assumptions. It's blind to its own privileges. Right? You have the privilege of using an iPhone to tweet about how unfair the iPhone factories are.
I view like the ESG stuff as just another mechanism of control that you can put over these large enterprises who have to be concerned with dollars and cents. But then you can say, well, these things align because of our academic research with dollars and cents, and we're going to bully you guys with these protocols that just happen to be controlled by entities like BlackRock.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a funny story. I run a company. I'm not a white guy, so I always tell people diversity is not my strength. If you want to work for me, we have to push in the same direction, right? We're a rowing team. If we don't pull in that direction, I don't care about your diversity. Every company, every country, everything that was ever built was built on a cohesive narrative of a vision, of people showing up saying, we need this to happen. It's funny, when those companies become profitable and wealthy, then after the fact, diversity would be really good. I'm like, is that how they got started?
Exactly. It's they actually raise, because what they're doing in effect, and I am sure there's many of them that understand this, is that they're raising the barrier to entry by saying, all of these other non-diverse companies, these startups and whatnot, they're the bad people, because they're all they're all the whites and the Asians and the Jews and whoever, and they don't have the right representation. But us here at Google and Apple, we
Mhm.
can we have the right people here, and look how successful we are.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll tell you a layer of this from the communist upbringing that we were forced to deal with, because I hear horror stories from my parents. But one of the things that was interesting was in Stalinist communist Russia, the idea was to inject politics into art.
Yeah.
And to inject politics into art was simple. Art is meant to be the experience of the divine, the numinous, as to quote Christopher Hitchens.
Mm-hmm.
It's to escape the reality of what you're into. Now, if that's the case, and you want to really control people, that's where you stop in. You inject your political policies into the art,
Yes.
so there's no escape from it, right? So now think about what's happening in the West. You inject politics into entertainment,
Yeah.
right? And you inject politics into the workplace. There's no escape from this now. You're basically literally marinating in it 24/7. I feel bad for you, because I'm sure when your kid goes to school and he's told that, oh, you're oppressive because you're white. If somebody
She
told that
will
to my
she
kid,
will not be going to those schools. I will tell you right now. We are gonna. I don't care if I end up in poverty. I'm not handing my child over to my enemies.
that's exactly it, right? And I look at it this way, because it's funny. People see me, they think, oh, he's one of us, he's our ally. I'm like, I'm as far from your ally as you could
Yeah.
possibly imagine. You just don't even know how much contempt I have for your point of view.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
again, I
You
let
just
it
know how to
trade,
keep your
right?
mouth shut.
Yeah, no, and the reason I keep my mouth shut is partly two reasons, right? One is asymmetry of information. I like to know how bad my enemy is thinking. I listen to Sam
Mm,
Harris's podcast because I like to know how bad my enemies are thinking.
yeah.
Sam Harris to me is an enemy of civilization.
Yep.
Period. End of discussion. Like
Yep.
whatever he says, all of his fancy high prose falutin crap. At the end of the day,
Yep.
we boil it all down. Enemy of civilization. End of
Yep.
discussion. Right. So now, why do we listen to him? Well, because I need to know what my enemies are thinking.
Yeah.
Right. And in my culture, here's one of the brutal facts of Afghan culture. In ancient times, that's pre communist invasion. If we went to war, you know what I would do to you for you in the morning before we get into battle? My grandma taught me this. I would take the traitors in my camp, slit their throats, and present them to you as a gift in the morning. So here we
Mm,
go. We're going to go to war, and this is my first gift to you. I want you to know that this is what's going to happen to you, right? Because if
yeah.
we're at this stage and it's about survival,
Mm-hmm.
that's the level of thinking we have to do to survive where we're
Yeah.
at. And the reason you slay a traitor's throat is you're getting rid of falsehood from your camp, right? In your camp, you cannot have a point of view that is undermining your overall strategy. That's the point of it. When you have people in the West, and I'll give you a clear-cut example of this. Two examples perfectly right in front of us. You have Game of Thrones, The House of the Dragon, and you have
Mm-hmm.
Lord of the Rings, whatever that crap is that
Yes.
they developed. Okay. So on the one hand, you took a story where you have female characters who give birth in the most agonizing way possible. In House of the Dragon, they're literally dying over giving birth.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that survive are actually managing political intrigue and complexity, fixated on their general role and the strength that gender brings to that role. Fantastic. On the other side of the equation, the female character doesn't have a husband, doesn't have a child, can fight 10 men and win.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is supposed to be empowering to women. I'm like,
Right.
you're basically misguiding a person so badly. And I'm okay with it. I'll tell you why. My nieces and nephews, I'm like, they come to me to tell me all the time, Uncle Ace, everybody's coming out as this and that. I'm like, this is perfect. I said, those people are being completely fooled into what reality is, and you're being trained on how to spot it.
Yeah.
So when the time comes and you have to place your bets, you're going to win. It's not
Yeah.
up to me to go and correct that child.
This
That child
is
wants to believe X. Great.
100%. This is what I want my enemies to believe, because it's going to make them fail.
That's right. Because remember, Napoleon said, never interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, I say that at the same time, but these ways of thinking have infected my friends and my family. And like, I'm aside from maybe one person in my family, my wife's side is I don't think is as far gone, but I only have one person on my side of the family that like sees these things like I do, and
Yeah.
it's bothersome to me for sure. And it's like how they, and it's not like I want to be a traitor to my family, but I can't accept these ideas because I think it will be the downfall of us.
Yes. So to follow up on that point of view, I have the same issue, right? So, luckily for me, my issue started when I rejected Islam. So I was already pre-battle trained, battle tested for this problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
To the new stuff. I look at it this way. I'm like, okay, look, I have allegiance to the truth. Now, I don't know
Yes.
what the truth is, but I'm going to try my very best to find it. And when I do, I'll try to have allegiance to that. Now, am I biased? Yes. Am I a hypocrite? Absolutely. I'm a human being. I'm not perfect. So I try my very best to minimize my hypocrisy. Whenever I make mistakes, I try to correct it as fast as I can so I don't make the same mistake twice. Now, with my family, I have what Dr. Hawkins called unconditional love. Like, unconditional love is a way of being. It's like, I will never use your mistakes against you, but I will also not indulge in your mistakes to help you in that direction. So I'm not going to propagate them in that way. So if you reject me, that's fine. But know this, and I've been rejected from many family outings and whatnot, and I've been told not to attend weddings and all that. And I've always thought to them, I said, that's okay. You're welcome to do all that. But understand something. When everything hits the fan, understand that you can call me. I will show up.
Yeah. 100%.
That's the lesson I learned from listening to Dr. Peterson talk about Jesus, right? It's like everybody will betray you, and if you can bear that responsibility, that even at their betrayal, you can still be the support net that they need, that's cool. But the consequence of doing that correctly is that I also don't need to depend on you for that. So I'm not going to call you when I'm in trouble, because I already see that before I'm in trouble, you've already cast me out. So my unconditional love stems from the fact that even though we disagree to the point where you're willing to cut me off, I'm not willing to do that to you. However, I will refuse to participate in your ceremonies of praising falsehood for truth. That's just not going to happen. So I'm okay with it. Like, if you want to have your kids, and I have a family friend, known the kid since he was born, is practicing what do they call it? Drag, right?
Yeah.
Right. So he's going down that road, and we had a conversation, and I'm in the room, and I have this rule: I never say anything unless somebody asks. Right. I'm not going to say anything. So I'm quiet, and usually they know that I have an opinion on most things.
I'm going to remember that rule. I need to take that one up.
It gives you peace of mind, right? Because again, it lets you know that I don't have to, like, the world is the way it is. If somebody wants to do something, and it goes back to the whole diversity notion that we need to encourage girls. I'm like, if you ever met a real engineer, you would have to put them in jail, and even in jail, they'll figure out a way to be an engineer. So let's cut the crap, right? So back to this conversation about the whole trans situation. They said, Ace, what do you think? I said, whatever makes you happy, but recognize the simple fact. I said, do not hit the absorption barrier. What's the absorption barrier? I said, well, it's a point of no return. If you do something that you can't take back, you will live to regret it. And all the studies show things are safe. I said, their studies are so short and so narrow that they're basically laughably absurd at this point.
Yeah.
How about you just take it easy and you bear witness to everything around you? Give it 10 years. Right. Because there are people now who are coming online and they're talking about their adverse reactions to the hormone therapies because their bones are becoming brittle. They're experiencing osteoporosis at the age of 30, right? Because they did this hormone therapy. And I said, hormones are embedded into your very way of being. It's in your bones. It's in your brain. It's everywhere. If you mess with that, exactly. You mess with that because you think you know better than nature, who created you to survive the harsh conditions of the Saharan desert. You are reckoning with a force so beyond your imagination that you have no idea what's coming your way. So my point of view on this is do it, but just don't do anything you can't undo.
Tread very lightly on this one. This is
extremely right. And so you can imagine there's a room about 27, 28 people, and I'm just the only guy who said that. And everybody's just kind of staring at me, and they're very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I said the truth is uncomfortable, unfortunately.
I was.
If you're gonna do it. I'll support you.
My wife and I are part of this parents group where we meet online, and they brought up, they asked the pronouns at one point, and they brought up a lot of these, a number of these woke ideas. I won't get into the specifics of it though. And it's like, I had to leave the room because I was just like, I can't, I'm going to go take care of the baby and put it down because I just didn't want to hear these things. My Jocelyn is like, Jeff, don't say anything. I want to be friends with these people.
No, it's good. And I take that as an opportunity to to learn a lesson in humility of your own
Yeah.
ego, right? It's like, okay, can I sit in a room with somebody who I vehemently disagree with and let them express their point of view without being emotionally triggered by them? Because it's, again, I always assume that, imagine you're being interrogated in a police station for the sole intent of cracking you, right? Game theoretical model. Can you have the composure to sit quietly and just listen? And I tell people all the time, I'm like, well, the vast majority of people thought that women shouldn't vote, and now they vote. The vast majority of people thought the earth was flat, now it's not flat. The vast majority of people think this. I'm like, okay, you know what? Let me take your idea of the vast majority and apply a different concept to it. What if I take you in a room full of 100 Taliban and we hold a vote as to what you should be able to do and shouldn't be able to do? Are you going to abide by that rule?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the assumption of democracy and majority rule all of a sudden collapses under the weight of its own assumptions, right?
Yeah.
So similarly, when you sit in a room like that, if you want to train yourself to rise above this stuff, one of the things you could really do is you could say, can I sit here and just listen to this?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I can listen to this person who I vehemently disagree with, and I could try to steel man their arguments live. Because one of the things that makes people really interesting, at least in my personal point of view, is the reason you are an interesting person is because you can, in real time, process information, and you can give insight by doing heavy lifting that most people wouldn't even notice because they don't have the pattern detection system built in like you do. And you're training that pattern detection system live, and you can actually extrapolate what they're saying in real time to let other people see this is the flaws in their arguments, right? And so it's a training mechanism. It's a perfect environment for you to hone your skills, to say, okay, I will sit in that room and I will listen to these people, and I'm going to do the mental heavy lifting of, first, I'm going to steel man everything they're saying, and then I'm going to take a look at their arguments and pick it bone from bone, just literally tear it apart. And then I could articulate that point of view in such a way that if I was to tell another person who listened to the exact same conversation, that they would look at what I was saying, and after the fact, they would say, initially I agreed with them, but now I see what your point of view is, and it doesn't make sense.
That process is like breathing.
It is.
I wish I could shut it off.
Right. And it's beautiful, right? And the thing is, think about that. That's your gift, right? That's what you bring to the table. That's what people don't have. A lot of people don't have that ability. A lot of people don't have that innate capacity to hold multiple thoughts at once and try to actually distill where it's true and where it's false and how they can do it. And so you have a part of your gift. And again, it goes back to my LSD trip when I had the temporary experience of heaven, quote unquote, and to speak, which was that you were blessed with these gifts. How many people have you bestowed that gift back to? Right. So I look at it that way, and I'm like, okay, again, I'm flawed. Sometimes I lose my shit on Twitter because, there's only so much woke crap you can take before you have to say something. But for the most part, I try. I don't want to come across all sanctimonious and be like, oh, I'm the self-righteous man, I'm Jesus 2.0. None of that. The point is, I try my very best to listen as intently as I can, and to hear a person's point of view. Like right now, everybody's dunking on Elon, and I'm like, look, I'm not saying he's perfect. And one of the things I learned, listening to people, slam Andrew Tate or slam Joe Rogan or slam Elon, I said, there was a time in history where we used to build statues. Can you think of a single person today who'd be worthy of a statue?
Right.
No, because we shit on every single person, regardless of their merits, because they didn't agree with one thing we said, we must destroy this person. Hence why we destroy all these statues, which means we're destroying our own civilization. Human beings are inherently going to be flawed. 100 years from now, whatever they think is true is obviously going to be false. So therefore, have some humility to look at it and say, hey, you know what? When you say something like, I like Joe Rogan, but I don't agree with everything he says, that what you're really saying to me is, I'm a piece of shit who thinks he's better than that person. I don't want to hear that. I get it. You're flawed too. So why don't we dispense with that crap and just state the facts? You know what? Joe Rogan has done fantastic things for me because he's exposed me to so many great minds.
If you don't I'm in debt to the man.
Right. My entire podcast was modeled based on his. Let's have a conversation. You and I did not have a script for this.
Like this. I mean, I hate explaining. It's like, what's your podcast about? Well, I'm trying to be like Joe Rogan, except not him.
Right. And the thing is, what Joe has done, and he tapped into this old force, which is that we are all built to sit around campfire, eat and talk, and to exchange ideas. And that's what we do. Right. And the minute you turn that into, can you subscribe to my listeners to this? And that's why on my podcast, I don't do any of that. And also, it's not my main source of income. So I get people who do it. I understand the business logic of it. But for me, it's like, look, I like you, so I want to have a conversation with you. Can I say some things that are interesting? Hopefully. Can I make this into a disaster like the Patrick David Bet and Antonio Brown conversation? Hopefully not, right?
I got to listen to that.
And it's what's crazy about that conversation is right off the jump, the way Patrick introduces him, he takes offense to it. And Patrick introduces him by stating all his accomplishments as a football player.
Oh my god!
And he takes offense to that. Like it's right off the bat. It's like a train wreck.
Oh.
I've never seen anything like it. But it's informative, right? And you watch
Patrick's
it.
So good of it as an interviewer too. He's like
fantastic.
top notch.
He's being, he's trying to be accommodating. And halfway through the conversation, Patrick takes off his headset. It's like, I don't even know if I want to continue doing this conversation. But I watched that and I said, okay, what could have led Antonio to become what he is, to behave that way? And I started to strawman his position. I said, he's probably been taken advantage of every step of his life.
Yeah.
People have probably lied to him nonstop and tried to make money off of him nonstop.
And he was completely unprepared for the position that he was put into. The money that he got, didn't know how to filter out the bad guys.
Yeah. And so for him, every single thing is like, oh, you're going to say that so you can turn it into a clip so you can get clickbait on my name and make money for yourself and make me look more of a fool than I already am. So I get it. And one of the things I resonate with that is like, I'll tell you a funny story about when I had my first startup, when I went into to meet with a VC. So long story short, it took a couple of meetings to get this guy to actually meet with me. So I show up at his office like 8:30 in the morning. We're supposed to meet at 9. So I see the conference room. I see his assistant, and she looks horrified. Like she looks like a person who's like literally reporting to Kim Jong-un, right? Like she's like the wrong words are said, and I'm like, I sense this energy. I'm like, what is happening here, right? So at first I'm like joking with her. She's just like, good luck. And the way she said it, I was like, right? So I get in the conference room and I'm like, okay, let me set up my laptop so I can do the presentation. And she's just looking at me and she's like, buddy, you're a bunny running into a buzzsaw. You have no idea what's coming your way. So again, I don't think anything of it. The guy shows up. I introduce myself and I'm like, so let me tell you about my company. You know what he said to me? He goes, shut the fuck up. Let me ask you a question. I have enough money here that enables me to piss on you, to drown you in my urine. Why should I listen to you? That's how he introduced himself to me. I was just like, am I on a different planet?
Where did you go with that?
Yeah. I stared at him and I said, you know what? I said, where I come from, when people speak like that, their throats get slashed.
Wow.
So I want you to understand who you're talking to. I don't need you. I thought you were going to be a decent human being when I was introduced to you, but we're done here. So I packed up my stuff and he just kind of turned around and walked out. As I was packing up my stuff, I walked over to his assistant and I looked at her. I said, find another job.
Yeah.
Right? So sometimes when you meet people who are that out of touch, that's when you asked me earlier, you think if somebody who's really wealthy, they would do all this crazy stuff. I'm like, yeah, I've seen people who are that, when you become that wealthy, you're that far, and Dr. Peterson talks about this. Like there's the fastest way to hell is for people to roll out the red carpet in front of you. When you're wealthy, everybody says yes to you. Everything around you is yes. You're going to turn into that person that you should never have become in the first place, right? Because falsely, your ego is going to say, the reason I'm this good is because I'm this special. And therefore, everybody who doesn't agree with me is beneath contempt. And I don't need to speak to them with any amount of respect.
Yeah.
Right. So now here's one of my areas of blessing. I am glad my first startup failed as miserably as it did, because it humbled me to the point where I realized, man, if I had become successful, you would have known me from a different point of view. I would have been that arrogant prick that everybody hates online, famous for how much of an arrogant prick he was, because that's who I would have been.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I certainly could have gone that direction if I had continued success in my earlier years. Like the humbling that I got in my mid 30s was like, okay, thank goodness that happened, because I could have just been a monster.
Yeah. And it takes a special kind of person. Now imagine that and flip it, right? Imagine you're Prince Andrew, whatever his name is.
Oh,
there's nothing that's going to humble that guy, right? He's so insulated from humility that what's going to humble him is going to be at his deathbed, maybe at his last breath. But there are people who are born like that, and now unfortunately those same people go to the same school of Ivy League places, and they have the same thoughts and they have the same ideas and they have the same narratives and they're pushing the same crap. And I like to think of them, and I learned this from my friend Mike, which is that there's two types of people on this planet. There's the command and control types who want top-down mandates, authority. This is the science, this is the law, this is the. And then there are people who are, from nature's point of view, adapt and survive. We're in that latter group. Like, put me in any situation, I'm going to figure out a way to adapt, and I'm going to figure out a way to survive.
Yep.
And the reason my approach is superior to yours, if you're a command and control type of person, is that I have one thing that you will never have, which is I have an ally in reality. Because if I have to adapt and survive, that means I have to get real-time information of what's coming in. When you are in the position you're in where you're doing command and control, you have no idea what reality looks like. Justin Trudeau runs Canada. He has no idea what the economy looks like.
No.
He has no idea how to run a business. That guy would probably take a lemonade stand and run it into the ground before he could, do anything else with it. But meanwhile, he's given access and control over one of the largest economies on planet Earth, and with his nonsense, managed to destroy the economy and has brought inflation upon the people. And it's because he was given undue privilege because of his last name, right? If it wasn't for his father, there's no way that guy would have ever gotten a seat of power.
Castro?
Well, the last name of his father, let's imagine it that way, right? So the other side of it, I look at it and I'm like, there are people who are in power now. And again, I always say, are you a king or are you an heir to the throne?
Yeah.
I respect kings. I don't respect heirs to the throne. I've never had, and reality has always borne aside for me that anytime somebody gets into a position of power, because they're the heir to the throne, they always mess it up. It's inevitable because they've never had the experience of what it's like to build something.
I think that there's there's a concept of like the 7 great Roman emperors, and it was like one of them, like I think they all were like appointed and they didn't become, and
yes.
it wasn't nepotism. Like, I wish it was with me, but I when you're given something as opposed to earning it, So let me ask you, like, what are your thoughts on democracy in general?
It's the best we could do relative to the worst of everything else that's available.
Is
However, and again, and the caveat emptor was always the case that if you're in a room with 100 Taliban voting, is it really the best you could do, right?
Yeah.
So I look at it this way. I'm humble enough to know that I don't know if there's a better solution. I can't say that I've thought of it deep enough to say that there's a better way to do this, because again, democracy is how we voted Hitler into power, right? He didn't it wasn't a coup d'etat. He voted himself in. And democracy is how we also got Joe Biden into position of power. What he's doing.
Well, maybe.
Right? I mean, ballots going out at night and showing up all of a sudden the changes of votes, and it's 100% in one direction. Yeah, the Afghan in me who saw the Soviets doing what they do, we're kind of suspicious, but
part of me thinks like what we really have is this like sort of oligarchy that has this veneer of democracy, and like it's kind of democracy, but it's kind of oligarchy, and I don't really mind it that much, except I kind of like really think the oligarchs are screwing up right now, and I wish they would fucking get their shit together. And I don't mind oligarchy that much.
Yeah, command and control, right? It's the way I always tell people is I'm like, the Republican and Democratic Party is like, do you want eggs or do you want an omelet? Right? It looks like they're different things. They're actually exactly the same. At the end of the day, they're the people that they're held accountable to, the interests that they're laying bare to are not going to be yours. They never were. They never are. And the only way out of this is to become financially independent enough to have guns and lawyers in your camp, right? If you can have your own security and you can have your own lawyers so nobody can really mess with you, then you have a solution out of the system. Anything else you do, something somewhere is going to catch you. And I look around and I say, okay, you know what? It's not that hope is lost, because obviously we have hope. It's that command and control always fails. Sometimes it takes a long time to fail. Imagine you were born into Russia just when Stalin came into power.
Oh yeah,
right. And then when his purge took place and all the leaders that came afterwards, you'd have to adopt a strategy that would fly bold into the face of somebody like Sam Harris, which is that you must lie to the tyrant. You have to, otherwise you're going to die, right? So you adapt in that situation. You say, okay, here's the new boss, same as the old boss. We need to increase our productivity, but no matter what I do, my life is just as miserable as it was yesterday. In fact, it's getting worse, because entropy and the way human life works is as you get older, things get worse for you. So how do I really have faith and hope in any of this? Well, the hope and faith you have in any of this stuff is to recognize that eventually, as Christopher Hitchens used to say, I live for irony, right? Irony is the revenge of the gods, right? So I will look at this and say, you know what? All the people who were very angry with me for not taking the pro lockdown, all that situation, all those people now are trying to, in a very snaky, sadistic way, walk it back. Oh, we need amnesty. Really?
Oh, that amnesty. Oh my gosh.
Right? Like to me, that speaks to a level of arrogance, the likes of which you can't possibly fathom. I was willing to deprive you of life. I was willing to revoke the Hippocratic sacred oath from you. But now I want you to pretend like it never happened. I'm like, you know what, dude? to quote Nietzsche, you've killed God and there's not enough water to wash away the bloods. You've stained your soul with betrayal to the rest of your fellow men, and there isn't enough water for you to wash that stain off. So
without a
I'm good with
doubt.
it. You live with that. I'm good with it. I know, and I want you to know, and I tell this to people all the time. If you believe that and you are willing to advocate for that position, I want you to know that you now live in a world where nobody trusts you.
Yeah.
Right? Good luck. That is the ninth circle of hell. Well, one of the things that happens when I had my bad shroom trip was I experienced that ninth circle of hell where you're sitting in a frozen cube, and what it is that nobody trusts you, nobody wants to be around you, nobody likes you. Do you know how do you know how terrifying that is?
Oh, I've
Because
been there.
right?
I have been there. Yeah, without a doubt. On a similar kind of trip. And I'll tell you, it wasn't, I didn't have a good trip really until I became religious to an extent, like
right.
had a sense of God. And once
Right.
I had that, took some mushrooms, wandered around in the woods, and it was like, how is this is nice now. Like
Right.
the universe is speaking to me in a positive way all of a sudden.
Right. No, and you know what that brings to me the idea that what we have to do, and in essence, for the vast majority of these situations, is we have to say that old quote is, I traveled far and wide and I looked for my enemy and I always found them in the mirror in front of me. Right?
For sure.
Right. It's your ego and your assumptions about how the world operates. And the reason I tell you that is, here's an interesting anecdote, right? It sounds simple, it sounds stupid, but if you think about it, it's kind of profound, which is like the word Billy means cat in Hindi, and the word Bishak means cat and Farsi. You're adding a label to reality, which has no bearing and consequence to what reality actually is. So any description of reality you have is an best an approximation to that.
Yeah.
So the further your approximation is, the more reality is going to check you hard when it's time to pay the bill. Right.
Yes.
So when it comes to betrayal of your fellow man, it shows a level of cowardice because you couldn't take the risk of doing it the right way. So what you did is you cut the corners and you betrayed them. And now you have to live with those consequences.
Yeah.
And so the worst element of all those experiences that you can have in life is that you can walk around knowing that, imagine as a man, tomorrow your wife and your child just stop respecting you.
Yeah.
You could live in the same house, but they just don't respect you.
Yep.
Right. There's no whole, and I know people, and I'll tell you, remind me to tell you the prison story after, but I know some prisoners who were in solitary confinement, and as bad as it is, because even in prison, you want to be around other people. You know what they had? They always had the hope that, oh, I only have to be here for X number of days. I can escape and I could be back with my boys for a month or two later. Because you need to be around other people, because then they'll have some sympathy or empathy for your position or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But that ninth circle of hell is, not only are you in solitary confinement, but nobody wants you when you leave.
Yeah.
There is nothing more shattering to the human psyche than that aspect of it. The realization that you're such a low-level piece of shit that nobody wants you.
Yeah.
Nobody. Even your enemies want nothing to do with you. This is why when we say the reason you slash the throat of your traitors in your camp is because those people are you're actually giving them mercy. Because what will happen is, if they, and this was borne out over centuries of war and whatnot, is that if they betrayed the camp and they joined the other side, as soon as that side won, the first thing they did was they tortured and murdered them, because they said, well, if you're going to betray your own kind, why would we want you on our side? You have no honor, right? Honor means something. It's like, why did you earn that medal? Well, because we played hard, we sweat. Why did you get the medal? Oh, because we showed up. Well, okay, different conversation, right?
When Alexander was conquering Persia, I believe that like one of the rulers of a city like killed the king when he was coming to try and like curry favor with Alexander, and Alexander killed him for being a kingslayer.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, right? There's rules to this stuff. And so I'll bring you back to the game theory model, right? So I used to work as a personal trainer before I went to school for finance and engineering. One of my clients was in prison, and he was basically like a white collar kind of guy, and he spent some time in prison. And when I met him, we were talking, and he said, oh, I have a lung capacity issue. Okay, so he showed me there's a scar on the left side of his chest. I said, okay, you're gonna have to, that there's obviously a story here. He goes, well, when you earn my trust, I'll tell you the story. Sure enough, a couple of months go into it, and we're talking, and we're having good vibes. And he said, do you want to know the story? I said, sure. He said, all right. So I'm in prison. I said, okay, let's start there. How did you get into prison, right? So now, long story short, I made some mistakes financially, and it ended up in prison. Okay, cool. What happened in prison? He goes, well, I was generally by myself, but people knew that I was a quote unquote smart guy. I said, okay. He goes, and as one of the ways you could tell you're a smart guy is you play chess. I said, okay. So he sat in prison and he was playing chess. And there was a gang, and the leader of that gang was really good at chess, that he used to beat all his cronies and whatnot. I said, okay, it's getting interesting. So what happened? He goes, well, I wanted the protection and respect of these people. So I decided that if the opportunity ever comes, not that I'm going to go to them, but if they ever ask me to play, I'll play them. I said, okay. So what happened? He goes, well, their leader eventually got word that, I'm really good at chess. So he invited me to play. But before he invited me, he was talking all this shit to his boys about how he's good and he's going to destroy me and all this stuff. And me being a wise ass thought it would be really good if I beat him. I said, okay. So he game theory modeled this out, right? I play him, I beat him, I predict his moves, and I get accepted as part of his gang because I've watched too many movies. I said, okay, what happened? He goes, as I started beating him, he just got up and he stabbed me in the ribs because he didn't want to lose in front of his boys. Right. So there's another example of a Kobayashi Maru, right?
Yeah.
So the guy, so you trapped him, you thought all of his moves ahead, but he was unpredictably violent and he basically put you in your place.
Yeah.
Right. So another example of what happens if you marry your models, right? So reality says, I'm going to stick a shiv in the side of your ribs, collapse your lung. And now when people say he really beat all his boys at chess, you have to wonder did he really beat them at chess or did they let him win, right? But the point is that he still remained undefeated because a hole in your lungs doesn't allow you to continue to play the game.
Hypocrisy is how you demonstrate power.
That's exactly it. But here's what's funny about it, right? So you think of Trump and how unpredictable he was. Everybody had to play not to lose. Right? So if you're China, if you're Russia, if you're North Korea, you're looking at this going, this guy's crazy. I don't know what he's going to do. So I have to just play not to lose. And when people say, "Oh, yeah, go ahead."
That was the Nixon thing. Nixon had the madman philosophy where he wanted to present himself as somebody that could just go off the rails at any point in time so he could keep people in line.
Well, think about it. That's the exact same strategy that Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping and all these guys are projecting back into the world, which is that the minute you think you know me, that's the minute you're going to box me into a corner and you're going to put me in a position where I can't play. But I want you to recognize something. Here's the foolish assumption that the bros of Barack Obama and his sweet words kind of people fell into, which was that, the Americans are really powerful. All we have to do is sanction Russia. Well, it kind of backfired, right? Because those guys aren't dumb. They're watching this. And if you're Putin or if you're Xi Jinping, you and I are buddies. Where you run China, I run Russia. We wake up in the morning, we get all our reports. The thing that's always going to stick in our craw is that all our economic gains are in US dollars. Doesn't sit well when you're that high on top of that mountain. That's the one thing that's going to bother you, right? So you're going to look for ways to bifurcate the global hegemony of the US dollar. And you're going to look for ways to actually start pulling people in the other direction because you want a world where woke capital isn't the only capital that dictates terms of business for you. Because those guys see it. They're like, hey, listen, they infiltrate this crap. We don't want those values in our country. That value is eventually going to show up here. Last night I showed up. I was at our Leafs game, Leafs and Bruins, and before the Leafs game started, they had this thing that they do now, which is something called a land acknowledgement. Have you heard of this thing?
Oh yeah.
Right.
Stolen land, blah blah blah.
Stolen land, this stuff. Yeah. So I look at them like, the entirety of our history is about stolen land. That's what we do. That's what our nature is. Yeah. So which
it's
people
are you going to conquer
separately, basically, right? And we say this as Afghans. I'm like, listen. We've been there's 5 tribes in Afghanistan. They go to war all the time, and when they go to war, it's nasty. Like the Hazara tribe, which recently just got like 150 of their girls who were trying to go to school were killed in a bombing. That's today. What they used to do to them is they used to boil oil and take their leaders and dip them in the middle of the public square. So you could see them literally being deep fried.
Yeah,
right. You get what I'm saying? Like that's the level of psychotic shit that's out there.
Yeah.
So for us, we look at that and we say, okay, the people who survived were tough, resilient, or they were adaptive. They start to recognize, okay, I need to survive this. So now what's happening is the people who survived are the soft, weak ones. And what they want is validation by being told that the other people should apologize to them. And I'm like, the world doesn't work that way. The world is a lot more cruel than you can possibly imagine. And if you don't believe that's true, Google how many idiots went around the world looking for, oh, everybody's cool, and then they showed up to like Syria and they got raped and thrown off a freaking cliff, right?
Yeah.
So
welcome to reality.
Welcome to reality. So again, that and it's not going to get better anytime soon. As much as you want to hope for that to be true, it's not, because like you said, infinite variance. Infinite variance also means infinite variance in violence. Different ways of sadism, masochism, all that crap that comes out there is going to be out there, right? Like, I don't know if you ever watched that story, that there's a clip of Saddam Hussein when he comes into power. Have you ever seen this thing?
Oh, I don't think so.
It's on
I don't
YouTube.
tend to
It's
watch
5
this
minutes.
kind of stuff. It's some things you can't unsee, and I try to avoid that.
Well, this one is very informative.
Oh, okay.
And I recommend it. I recommend
this
it.
isn't
5
like
minutes long.
watching
No, no,
people
no, no,
get killed or anything like that. Okay.
No. What this is it's utterly fascinating. And to his credit, the man who brought it to my attention obviously was Christopher Hitchens, because he was talking about it. He said, so what happened is it's in black and white. It's documented. It's video footage, because Saddam loved to film this stuff. So he's sitting in a council of all the people in charge and power in Iraq. Okay. So he's sitting there, and a guy stands up and he starts naming names. Like an episode of Seinfeld, right? You name names, right? So all of a sudden, people are being dragged into the hall who are traitors to the party and who are traitors to the country. And now, one by one, these people are being dragged outside. And the people who are sitting in that room, you could see the panic just spread right across their face, because they recognize that, oh my God, if my name gets called, I'm going to be sent out there.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, these men who are all, powerful, mighty, all of a sudden they start standing up and they're saying, long live Saddam, long live Saddam. And he's sitting there and he lights a cigar as he's watching his enemies get purged. Right now, that's a Hitler-esque, Stalin-esque move, but he did something then again, I'm paraphrasing literally word for word Christopher's words, so this is not my insight, this is just him talking. And he said he did something that even those guys hadn't thought of. You know what he did? Everybody who survived the purge in that room, who were yelling long live Saddam, were told, outside are the enemies of the state, pick up your guns, go outside and shoot them.
Yeah.
So now your hands are stained with the blood of my enemies.
Oh, and they're part of it. And now they're the ones to be revolted against. If Saddam goes down, they're bonded.
That's cool. But here's what he did, was one step further. The people who got shot, their families were sent a bill for the bullets.
Oh, Jesus.
You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's the kind of man, and it's a 5-minute video, black and white, anybody could see it. Now, you don't see the killing part, you just see the names being called out, and you see Saddam sitting in the middle of the on the stage and just smoking his cigar as the entire party's being purged.
I mean, if a prince must commit atrocities, he needs to do them early.
Right. And he did that very early. And there's stories. I have friends from Iraq, and like I said, when I talk to people and I say, I know a guy who got stabbed in over a chess game, they're like, I don't even know what world you're living in. I'm like, I live in the real world, where I interact with people who didn't go to Harvard and Yale. And although I do have friends who went to Harvard and Yale, it doesn't really matter. But what's interesting is that the stories you hear from Iraqis, the Iraqi people have this absolutely horrific history bestowed upon them just by this one psychotic man and his family. What he used to do was, a friend of mine told me the story about his cousin. You're sitting in your house, and all of a sudden there's a knock on your door. Never a good thing in a country like that. You knock on the door, is you're gonna live Kafka's dream, right? So nightmare, sorry. So he's sitting there and he goes, what happens is the police show up, and it's always a bad thing when the police show up, but they show up in this case and they tell you that your daughter is missing. But now what you have to do, because the police showed up, is you have to invite them to dinner. So then you have to bring them in, you have to cook food. And for entertainment purposes, they'll put a video of them raping your daughter.
Oh, yeah.
And you get to watch it with them. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, the Taliban are much worse than that.
Yeah.
To an extent people can't even possibly fathom, right? Like they will rape children in front of their parents, not just their daughters, but their children, like young girls who are not even at the age of puberty yet, that type of stuff. Right. So the level of psychosis that's out there is not something you can ever get away from.
Yeah.
So to think that we're all in this lovey-dovey, happy go kumbaya world where diversity is our strength, you're so sadly mistaken that you have no idea what's coming your way.
Yeah.
Right. And you're gonna get blindsided so hard that it's gonna, like I said, I think this through. So let's take a look at this conversation of this trans ideology of giving kids, these hormone blockers. 20 years from now, when that regret sets in, and those conversations have to be had. They're going to look at their parents and say, how could you let this happen to me?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, when they look at me with my friend whose child I've known since he was birth, I could say, look, I did one thing, which is I just told you be careful. I didn't stand in your way because it's your choice. You could do whatever you want, but at least I had the courage to tell you to not do anything that you can't undo, because at least I had the courage to tell you that much. Now, the fact that your parents and your other uncles and relatives and whatever, they just kind of cheered you on blindly as if this is some sort of moral accomplishment, like you just became Buddha, you just became enlightened. That is something they're going to have to live with.
Yeah.
Now, some of them, to their credit, they just don't know. They don't think this stuff through. I, as a person who's an entrepreneur, I always look for informational asymmetry, right? I'm like, what is it that I know that you don't know? And how can I help you benefit from that? Now, I'll tell you once. If you don't listen the first time, I will never tell you again. Because now I'm like, you know what? It's wasted upon you. That whole idea of pearls to swine from the Bible, it comes to me, right? If I have a piece of knowledge that I can help you with, and I could tell you that this doesn't work, and you don't listen to it the first time, the second time, I will never say a word to you. I will just let you do whatever it is you think is best. And I'm going to let you live with the consequences of it. Because as Dr. Hawkins taught me, the way you have to think about karma is, if you stand in front of a barn and you light a match and you throw it into the barn, karma is what happens as a consequence of that action. You can't stop it once the blaze gets started. You could run, you could regret it, you can get all the water you want, but that barn is coming down, right? Sometimes people set the world ablaze, and it's ignorance allows you to do so, but the perpetrators of the blaze are not the people who are ignorant. They're just the fodder. The perpetrators are the people who think they're so smart that they think it's actually a good idea.
Yeah.
Get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like when you see CNN and they're like, yeah, you know what, the riots is a good thing because it helps people understand systemic injustice and whatever. I'm like, you want systemic injustice? Please leave the United States. Go to any other country on planet Earth, and you have this conversation with them. And you're toying with things that you don't understand. You're messing with things that you cannot appreciate. And you think and it's funny for them because they're like, oh, why are the Hispanics becoming conservative, and why are the Muslims in Dearborn
yeah, they don't get it.
Conservatives? It's like because they understand something that you don't understand.
Yeah.
Right. And it's sort of the same thing, the conversation that happens around abortion, right? They always give you the extreme case. What if the mother was raped and her life was, I'm like, that's fine.
Yeah.
But you can't use that edge case for all the other cases. What you need to do is you have to say, across the spectrum of why this is a thing that happens, here are the consequences of it. When it's not rape, when it's not the mother's life in jeopardy, when it's the blah, 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 what's the number that's left over? How are you justifying that number? Right? Now, again, the conversation of abortion is testy and it's tricky because people pick two invalid points from where to start that conversation, which is, well, you're a human being from the minute of inception versus you're a human being at the time you're born. And there's nuance that's lost in that. So we're not going to take points of it, but we always say as a society, self-terminating strategies don't really necessarily work itself
Precisely. Out. Self-terminating strategies don't work. And there are effects on a culture that doesn't revere life and doesn't revere motherhood and have a point of view towards sex and sexual promiscuity that change behaviors and how we function that I'm only coming to grips with recently.
Yeah. It's at the end of the day, like I said, and I learned this from just watching the people around me, and I learned this from Dr. Peterson and all the other people that are, bringing out these points of view, which is that when I was a kid, if you wanted a girl to go out with you, you had to work for it. Like you had to have the courage to go talk to her. You
had to have yourself put together.
Yeah. And do you know how hard it is for a teenage boy to walk up to a girl with all her friends next to her locker and to ask her out, knowing that not only will she reject you, but she'll reject you in front of her friends.
Yeah.
Right. Now that puts some chest hair on you to sort of speak. But I think it's a good thing that happened, because that means before you had the courage to do that, you had to really step your game up. Right. You had to be, okay, do I look good? Did I get a fresh haircut? Am I excelling in school? Am I the kid doing well in the sports teams? Do I have all the stuff that would make it so that she
are you trustworthy? Does she feel safe around you?
Yeah. Now today, man, I've seen videos on TikTok where the kids, they create this little robot hand that just swipes right for Tinder all day long, and they turn it on, they just let it swipe, and they're like, okay, tonight's meals are ready to go. Right? It's like Uber Eats for the different conversation.
Yeah, right? and women start feeling, they feel the effects of this, but they don't know what to do because they've been ingrained with this idea that it's a liberation of sorts. to be
Yes.
allowed to do whatever they want.
Yes. And an interesting element of that aspect of it is and I always tell people, I'm like, you are free to do whatever you want. What you're not free from are the consequences of your actions.
Right.
And so here's one of the consequences of your actions. What you will end up with is a life where the person who you are marrying is not the life you expected it to be. And here's what I mean by that. And this comes from Afghan culture, which at first I didn't understand, but now I'm starting to appreciate it.
Yeah.
Marriage is not about love.
Right.
Marriage is a contract about duty. And what I mean by that is when you're sick and you're old and you're basically almost shitting the bed, so to speak, is there a person willing to tolerate you in that state?
Yeah.
And the only way they're willing to do that for you is if you're willing to do the same for them. Because all this lovey-dovey, happy-go-lucky crap that they sell you at the Walmart and the Disney movies, none of that is true. Right? All that stuff washes out. When you're really old and you're really sick and you're really infirm and you can't handle yourself, that's when your partner's devotion to you comes to fruition.
And hopefully your children are around to help with that. And like the fact that people aren't having children as much and put their faith that somehow they're going to be taken care of, single, childless, in their own age, in the worst state of being, alone with their own thoughts.
There's that element of it, which brings me to my point about my parents live with me, because in our culture, you don't throw them out.
Yeah.
You don't get rid of them. You don't put them in a home. You deal with them because they dealt with you.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the covenant before God, to speak, so to speak, to say, look, you know what? They gave up so much for me to be here. For me to abandon them at this point would be the level of hubris of that, and the level of entitlement to that is so beyond absurd that I can't even fathom it.
And you need to set the example for your children so that
they'll
take care of you and demonstrate that contract and bond.
That's exactly it. And the thing is that people go, oh, well, you know, you're not raising slaves. I'm like, it's not about slave. It's about think about it this way. When you go to the SEAL school, right? They don't force it upon you. You could quit anytime you want to ring the bell, right? But what makes you a SEAL is that you stuck through it. You made it. You chose to do that. That's why they're the best in the world at what they do. Mm-hmm. It's not because they were conscripted. It's because they chose that path. I could choose to leave, you know, as a software engineer, as what it is I do, multiple opportunities to just go out on my own, do what it is I do, leave them behind, say thanks for everything, but this is the way the world works. No, my choice is, look, I will not accept victory if it's hollow and meaningless because I left behind the people who gave everything to get me here. Right?
Yes.
And so the idea of marriage in the West is a miscalculation on a gross level. It's this idea of that equality, empowerment, all this stuff. I said, okay, here's the first question about equality. The first question about equality you have to ask a person, including anybody who's of that camp, is say, middle of the night, intruder knocks in. Are we equal, or are you standing behind me?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Oh, well, you're just a misogynist because, well, I'm like, okay, let's forget the guy who's intruding at you in the middle of the night. Here's a different one. Massive lawsuit comes into the house. The house has got to be repossessed, whatever. Massive medical condition. Who's going to handle the burden of that load?
Yeah.
Do you want to be 50-50, or do you want me to handle it for you? Right? And there's a chain of command that's followed, which is the universe or God or truth or whatever you want to call it. For me and you, the word God is appropriate. A man's position on earth is to be God's representative, to be judgment. The mother's job is mercy, right? I stand, and my job, if there is a intruder, is to die for my family before anything happens to them. That's just a fact. I would never want I've been in situations when I used to work, like I told you, when I was helping that translating, when I was working as a bouncer, when I was walk with my girlfriend, I'd always tell them, if a problem jumps off, the best thing you could do for me is to run away.
Yes.
I don't want you near the situation.
I don't want you watching what's going to happen either.
No, because if I get killed or if something like that happens, you don't need to see that. You don't need to be part of it. If I have to worry about you, I'm going to lose. Yeah. So just get away from me, get away from this person, and let's just walk away. Now, I do my very best to never get into a physical altercation with anybody because, again, you never know what the other person knows.
It's too dangerous.
It's too the risk profile on that case is off the charts. You get hit, you fall, you hit your head, you have a stroke, you die, whatever.
That's all it takes.
You lose your brain. It's all it takes, right? The person has a knife, they have a gun, whatever. So physical altercations are never the right solution to this problem. But it's the idea. The idea is when shit hits the fan, are we really 50-50 or not? Because if you think we're 50-50, then here's what I'm going to do for you. And say, okay, we have a household to run. Here's all the bills. Do you take half? Go ahead. Oh no, by the way, I don't feel like going into work today. I really have a headache. Can you take on the rest of the bills? Nobody wants that job.
Yeah.
Right. But it's your honor and your duty to take that job. Now, some people find that, oh, well, da, da, da. I'm like, look, a woman who goes to work and chooses to work, great. When it comes time to handle responsibilities, there has to be a chain of command, because if there's no chain of command, things collapse. Now,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that she's your slave or you own her and you tell her what to do. It just means that you have to say, when the tough times come, and they will, when the tough decisions come, and they will, I will consult with you. I will ask for your input,
Yeah.
but the final decision is mine, because I have to bear the consequences of that decision. So most people don't like that. But in the Afghan culture that I've grown up in, now I start to see it. It's like, okay, I see that in the culture, there are people who are miserable, but they stay married for their kids, so their kids don't come out completely messed up. Is that better than the alternative where, well, everybody deserves to be happy? No, you don't. Who says you deserve to be happy? You're
Mm.
alive. You're lucky to be alive. People lived in freaking concentration camps. So forget your little self-indulgent fantasy. The fact of the matter is, you're alive. You're surviving. Your job is to minimize harm to yourself and everybody around you. And happiness, if it comes as a consequence of your accomplishments, great. If it doesn't, tough luck, sunshine. Right?
Yeah.
Shit's going to happen. Now, the modern woman, the modern ideology that they've been taught, is starting to change. People are starting to see that this whole Tinder world is not really that beneficial
Oh
to
yeah.
women, right? And to be honest with you, if you're a man who's healthy, attractive, capable of nuanced conversation and selling a thing or two, there is nothing better in the world than a bunch of women who just want to sleep with you with no strings attached. Because like, hey, are you telling me that I don't have to? Okay, right?
I fell down that trap for a little while.
It's not bad, and the thing is, it's not good for you either.
It's
Right?
not good. It's terrible.
It's not good for anybody. It's completely asinine. And now, I mean, I told you, I am glad. And I'll tell you this funny story. When I was a kid, pornography was very difficult to get by, because you had to get it on a video cassette, because the internet wasn't around.
Yeah.
Right? And I remember my first encounter with that problem, which was a buddy of mine had discovered his dad's stash.
Yeah.
And this is when we were just like, hey man, what's going on with this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we had to plan this thing for 3 weeks. We had to all get like papers to sign that we're allowed to leave school for lunch. And the day we had to leave for lunch was a day when my buddy's mom would be at work, and we would be able to sneak in for lunch and just to see what this stuff is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's coordination. We were nervous. It took like all this. So we finally get to the day, and we're like, it's lunchtime. We're like, okay, not everybody leave at the same time. You leave 5 minutes later, and we'll meet at this location. We'll run to the apartment. And anyway, so we get all this stuff going.
You had logistics for this.
Oh my god, right? There's like a whole supply chain management situation built into this. So we get to the house, and we're all just sitting there, and I'm like, I have a bad feeling about this. Like, oh, don't. I said, no. What if your mom walks in right now? We didn't think this through. What are we all doing here? She doesn't know why we're here. Oh, she's not going to come. I said, okay. We're going to take turns. So one of us is going to stand downstairs. And if you see her come up, warn everybody we have to leave. One of us is going to, we're going to take turns just so we can watch what this is. No, nobody's ever seen a movie like this before.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So we get all this stuff set up. We grab the tape. And as we're about to put it in, door opens.
Yeah.
Oh, sweet Jesus. Right. So now his mom comes in, and everybody bolts. Like they leave like I'm basically sitting in the living room right now with just her walking in. So I had the peace of mind to recognize that I just have to hit the power button and turn everything off so nothing looks like it's on. And then I can just kind of convince her that, it's all good. So she comes and she's surprised. She knows me. Oh, Ace, what are you doing here? I said, oh, we just came home for lunch. It's Friday. We wanted to kind of just relax instead of being outside, because it's not such a, bullshit excuse. Bullshit. She sees right through me, right? She looks to the balcony and all the other boys are there. And now I have a different conversation, because I'm like, oh, all the boys are here. She sees me. I got caught, but now I can play a different story and bring all them into the conversation. Now they're standing outside and they're just completely freaked out, right? Remember, we're grade 8. We don't know what's going on, right? So she goes, I'm going to go wash up and I'll come back and I'll make you boys some lunch. Okay. So she goes to the bathroom and I immediately run to the VCR to grab the tape and I pull it out. And now I have a problem, because if I run across to put the tape back to where it needs to go, she's gonna see me. Mm-hmm. So I run to the balcony. The guys are basically literally about to piss their pants, right? So I'm like, listen, who has their bag with them? One of my friends happened to grab his bag with them. I don't know what he was thinking, because I'm like, you're gonna jump off the balcony? Like, why is your bag with you, right? Open the bag, put it in there, and then we're gonna give it to him. And when he comes home, Hector was his name. Hector was gonna put it back where he needs to. So long story short, that was the battle you had to go through just to get access to it, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Now pull up an iPod Touch, Wi-Fi, you're good to go.
It's unbelievable. Yeah.
It creates a level of decay because the value of what it is on the one hand
Yes.
is nothing. But more importantly, on the other side of look at the asymmetry of it, right? You look at the average porn star. They're like a 10 out of 10 on every dimension. There's no girl in real world or any guy they have a six pack. They're like 50 feet long. They're thick, all that
Yeah.
jazz,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
No guy's going to match that. And the girls are like, 20-inch waist and like double D's and all this other jazz.
Yeah.
Their butts are like, it's like you look at that and you go, okay, now they've created a cartoon version of what a human being's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
And this is what you're supposed to aspire to.
And
The detrimental effects of this.
And I think there's now, I'm seeing this a lot more on Twitter with guys, who are saying stop watching porn, like you're really ruining your minds by it. And I think there's huge validity to it. Like I just I can't remember the last time I watched any, and it's you just don't want your mind preoccupied with unreasonable fantasies that affect your expectations. And and I mean, I grew up through the phase, and I think as you did also, where all of this was new, and it was just this industrialization and exploration, and it's like, I don't think it's a good road to go down. It's like doing. It's like, yeah, cocaine, a lot of fun, but you're really getting all of this euphoric feeling for too little investment, and you end up screwing yourself up a bit.
Absolutely. And I'm going to touch on that on two things that are going to be of interest to you here. One, you look at this idea of the fantasy that's being created, right? And the fantasy the reality never lives up to the fantasy. Right. It kind of circles back to our Bitcoin problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sales pitch doesn't match the reality of that's being delivered. So there, it kind of ties into it again. The same problem showing up in multiple places. Back to the drugs concept, right? So I grew up around a bunch of people who were basically potheads, right?
I was a pothead for years.
For years, right? Most people are, but now what's happened is those same people have become dull and completely uninteresting. And so I sat down one day with a friend of mine, and he invited me to their house. And I like to cook, so I usually get to do the cooking while everybody's just chilling. And we're talking. They're like, "Hey, you kind of grew up with this, but you never did this. Like, what's your deal?" I said, "Well, there's an asymmetry there that I want you to pay attention to." I said, "Okay." I said, "Do you think the thing that you're smoking is actually marijuana?" Well, yeah, of course it is. I said, "No, it's not." I said, "What you found in nature and what you have in your hand are two different things."
Oh, sure.
Like, what do you mean? I said, "Well, think about it. When the thing got discovered, it was cool. But then they made it illegal." They said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay. So if I'm a drug dealer and I want a customer, I want a repeat customer." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Now I'm told I can only carry so much on me before I'm considered a dealer. So I have to carry smaller doses, which means now the psychoactive part that actually makes you feel a certain way has to be amplified. And the parts that kind of numb that out because of the natural plant are no longer visibly there, because I have to get my biochemists and my botanists and all these people involved and have to do things to this plant so that it's much more potent at smaller doses than it would have been naturally found in nature." Oh, I said, now take that process, amplify it, multiply it, amplify it, multiply it. 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now. I said, do you remotely think that what you're smoking is what was actually found in nature? It's not there. It's not close. It's not even close to it. It's kind of like what happened with fruits, right? Fruits naturally found in nature are more acidic, like vitamin C, than they are sweet. But you can't sell those things as easy as you could sell sweet things. Just like we bred wolves into dogs, we bred these plants with these fruits to be extremely sweet because kids like sweet things and adults like sweet things. And so same thing with the marijuana. We took the asymmetry of information. What is the amount of weed I can carry with me that is going to have the maximum potency that the customer will be happy? It'll be under the legal limit from which I could be prosecuted, but it'll be enough that I can get the customer to come back and buy it from me. Those are your two constraints. Right? From a technical, economic, and social point of view, those are your two constraints. So you're going to create a hybrid product that doesn't even remotely reflect reality, but you're going to still call it what it is. Oh, this is organic. Well, good luck. This is weed. It's not really weed. It's a total chemical fabrication of whatever you think you're smoking. It's not what it is.
Right.
And so the damage that it's going to lay into
from the same lineage, but it's not the same thing.
Exactly. Right. So and unfortunately, in this case, it's the reverse of the wolf to the dog. Right. It's the dog to the wolf now, because you took a little seemingly harmful plant and you turned it into a wolf that in small doses it's still effective.
Yeah.
And so people are not going to notice the effects of this problem because this is a one of those issues where it's a technical and a political truth combined into the nastiest outcome, which was that now you have people addicted to this thing. You legalize it so the state can make more money from it, but what you're really doing is you're numbing the minds of everybody around them.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I tell people, I'm like, do what you want to do, but recognize what you're doing, what you think you're doing are two different things. Right. You think you're just chilling and relaxing and zoning out, but what you're actually doing is you're ingesting really heavily modified, chemically induced products that are nothing like that you would find in nature, but you think that's what you're doing, and it's not true. And it's sort of like when you do, I'll give you an analogy of this, when you do pull-ups, right? So a lot of guys, when they do pull-ups, this is a simple thing you could test. How old is your baby?
4 months.
4 months. Okay. Well, it's she?
Yes.
She. Okay. So when she starts to crawl, I want you to notice where she positions her arms. Okay. When you crawl, the baby's arm is essentially almost next to their head. And that's how they start when they're crawling, right? So that's your lat muscle. That's your biggest back muscle on your body. When you're crawling, that's what you're doing. But bodybuilders, when they pose for their lats, it's this big wide thing that they're showing you on stage. So what is that wide muscle? It's not your lats anymore. That's your teres major.
Okay.
Right. It's a big different muscle. It's if you look at the anatomy of it, it's a much smaller muscle relative to the latissimus dorsi, and it's entirely predicated for a different reason. It's basically one of your rotator cuff muscles for your shoulders. Why do I notice? Because I tore mine up. That's how I know.
Okay.
so what happens? So you want a big wide back. You want a V shape. That's what the guys are interested in. So of course the gym caters to this. What they do is they give you this lat pull down bar that allows you to grip it really, really wide. And you pull it down. You think you're working your lats, but you're actually working your teres major. Now here's the problem. It gets compounded. The weight that you're pulling, that you think your biggest muscle in your back is pulling, is actually not the muscle that's involved. It's a smaller muscle. And you're putting a load on that muscle that it's not meant to handle.
Okay.
And as a consequence, you're going to mess up your rotator cuffs. And when it tears, it's going to be painful on a level you can't even imagine. And it's something that you can never recover from, because I have a torn rotator cuff because I fell for that. Arnold Schwarzenegger was my guy, right? Follow the Arnold method. Well, that's when he was taking steroids and his back was beautiful. And every kid who was 15 years old wanted to look big because that's how you thought you can get the girls, right? So you do the wide grip lat pull downs. Again, it's like sort of like marijuana. What I thought I was doing and what I was actually doing were two different things. So the asymmetry of information was exploited against me, and I tore my shoulder, right? So to this day, my right hand is not the same as my left, because I tore my biceps tendon on the right side, because my teres major was overdeveloped, because I was working a muscle that I wasn't really supposed to be working, because I thought I was working the biggest muscle on your back, which is your latissimus dorsi. Not true. All of it was false. All of it was detrimental to me. None of it was visible, because when I was younger, you could do all these things and none of, it's just a back workout. It's great. Do it. Not true. When you watch your baby crawl, when you watch where she puts her forearm, it's literally almost next to her head. That's her lat muscle. So when you do actually do lat pull downs, your arms should be almost next to your head, because that's where your lat muscle actually engages from. But when you see guys doing lat pull downs in the gym, their arms are about as wide as that bar will let them go.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the same problem. Information gets propagated. It's never checked. The assumptions of it are never checked. The goal for why that muscle was trained the way it was is never checked. And all of a sudden, everybody wants a wide back, because apparently that's the good look. Because the bodybuilders thought the asymmetry of a nice wide back to a small waist was looking good. That's what everybody thought was a good looking idea to go chase after. And here we are. Right. And same thing with weed. I'm going to smoke weed because I'm going to be creative like Willie Nelson. Newsflash. Willie is creative without the weed, and he'll be more creative. You're not Willie Nelson, right?
We're just talking about more optimization and fragilization problems, exactly. and the bodybuilders is one of the examples that I tend to use to illustrate this the most. One of the guys who came after Arnold, the black guy who is like Mr. Olympia for like 8-10 years. Ronnie Coleman, yeah. Absolute monster of a man, and he has screwed up his legs, his back, his knee, like everything is just shot. And it's like, he was this era when the guys, you had to be as big as humanly possible. At least with Arnold, it was more about proportions. But you're like Ronnie, like, sure, it's proportions, but it's just these giant, and he completely ruined his body going for it. It's that's my favorite example of like how you can fragilize an entire other system by trying to optimize to one extreme.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to the childhood infantilization of the modern psyche, right? Which
Yeah.
is like, I want the best of like. Remember when you played? I don't know if you ever played video games when you were a kid.
Oh me and video games have a close
Right?
relationship
You,
over the
you get what I'm saying,
years.
right? So you want to create that player. You want to give him
Yeah,
100 on everything, right?
exactly.
Remember? Oh, I want him
Yep.
to be fastest, strongest. Blah, blah, blah. That's our fantasy.
Yeah.
Reality is like trade-offs, right?
Right.
So this is a trade-off. You are going to get X in exchange. We're going to shorten your lifespan by Y.
Yeah.
All right. So it goes back to exactly what you said. Nature does not give you a free lunch. Nature always extracts a cost. And the cost is the thing that you're not paying attention to. It's that risk profile. Right. It's that whole idea of like, one of the things we've done now is we've somehow convinced all of the people on planet Earth that science is only science if it's peer reviewed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, science doesn't work that way. Science doesn't care if 10 of your friends agree with you. Science is science if reality agrees with you. So a clear-cut example of it is, there's this guy who does these videos on YouTube for debunking specific myths or whatever, and he's like,
Yeah.
everybody does these cold showers or cold baths, and it seemed interesting, but I needed some peer-reviewed data for it. I'm like, really? Like, people have been doing this for there's a city in Russia, like the coldest city on earth. People there do ice baths in the morning, right? Like, they've been doing this. I said, listen, when you ask for peer review, what you're signaling is that you are apart from nature, that you're not, you want that clean system that has no interactions with nature.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to see the benefit of it, just go do it. People have
Yeah.
been doing it for hundreds and thousands of years in different parts of the world. And if they see the benefit of it, they'll do it. Now, why do you need a peer review paper to validate something that's already been happening? If it wasn't, let me put it to you this way. If going into ice baths was detrimental to people or killed you or made you worse,
Yeah.
people would have stopped doing it a long time ago.
They wouldn't have lasted. Yeah.
They wouldn't have
Yeah.
lasted.
It's epistemological arrogance.
That's exactly what it is. And modernity, as Paul likes to say, is the idea that everything new and shiny is good, everything old is bad, and nothing peer reviewed should be ever considered for real consideration.
Yeah. I will say that what you just articulated there is probably one of the greater shifts of my thinking over the past 10 years. And I feel a lot better for it. Ace, I'm going to need to end this.
Yes,
We've
sir.
been doing this
Absolutely.
for about 4 hours now, man.
Yeah,
this has been awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your wise conversation, and hopefully we can be in touch more often, more frequently, and we'll carry this forward.
This was a ton of fun, Ace. I didn't have to, we covered so much of my notes, yet I didn't have to look at my notes almost at all during this 4 hours. I really appreciate your time. And
my pleasure.
Yeah, we'll talk again. This was awesome.
Thanks, brother. Have a great day.
Take it easy.
Bye-bye.